A young boy and a young girl sit underneath a tree reading a book quietly. Suddenly, the boy stands up and closes the book with a bright smile. He declares that he's decided to become the greatest adventurer. The girl beside him suddenly grabbed onto his clothes, complaining that it wasn't fair because she wanted to be the greatest too. The boy stares at her for a moment before breaking into a grin. He tells her that he'll be the best, and the girl named Polaris would also be the best. Determinedly, he says that the two of them would be the greatest adventurers together. Polaris gapes at him for a second before breaking into a happy smile as well, agreeing with his promise. Time passes, and the young man from before Essen stares up at a screen with adventurer rankings. He grimaces as he sees that his rank is still at 96,743 bro. That's quite the ranking. He suddenly crouches down into the ground, roughly ruffling through his hair in stress. It's been 4 years and his rank has failed to move at all. Behind him, a couple of adventurers whisper and sneer at him. In not-so-quiet voices, they whisper how even rookies were beating Essen in contributions. One of them laughs and calls him Essen the eternal last place. The man adds that he should just become a farmer already. From his place crouched down on the floor, Essen blushes in embarrassment behind his hands. Adventurer Rankings was a ranking table that automatically updates at sunrise, listing adventurers' achievements and evaluations. The names of all registered and active adventurers in the guild are recorded. Filled with fiery determination, Essen forces himself to pull himself together and not to give up. He looks back at the adventurer rankings, finding the name Polaris. He smiles proudly. He clenches his fists, remembering that he had a promise to keep with her. Suddenly, he catches parts of a conversation as someone exclaims that someone had risen up to ninth place. He looks up at a pair of adventurers on the second floor, loudly talking about Ice Princess Polaris. Damn, she has a whole title to herself. One of the men is amazed, seeing as Polaris had the fastest rise in the guild. The other man boasts that he knew from the start that her aura was totally different. Unable to help himself as he listened to their conversation, Essen smiles at their words. The pair of adventurers catch sight of his smiling face, weirded out that he was apparently smirking in their direction. Okay, to be fair, that does sound weird to be doing, Essen. Suddenly, the topic of their conversation turns to him as one of the men says that he saw Essen rummaging through a restaurant's garbage, much to the other adventurer's disbelief. The adventurer comments that Essen was the complete opposite of the Ice Princess. They move to leave, but before they're completely out of sight, they make it a point to say that just looking at Essen makes them smell like garbage and they should leave because it might be contagious. Essen manages a small awkward laugh before it falls away. He suddenly slaps his cheeks to get a hold of himself, thinking that he was already used to hearing things similar to that, so there was no point in letting it bother him. He cheers himself to do his best today as well. At the borders of the city, a large barrier blocks the path. Essen holds out a hand to the barrier and it breaks open for an entrance to form. It was the F-rank dungeon White Mist Forest. As Essen walks into the forest, he catches sight of a group of rabbits. Suddenly, a wolf throws itself at the rabbits, immediately taking one of them into its mouth. More of the beasts arrive and dig into the rabbits. Essen hid behind a tree, peeking behind it to make sure that they hadn't caught sight of him. The forest wolves were still young, so they were moving in packs. However, they still took down the swift forest rabbit so easily. Long ago, there was a war between gods and demon gods. The result was a stalemate, but with their last bit of power, the demon gods cast a curse to create monsters from the earth. In response, the gods used their last power to create barriers, dungeons, to contain the monsters, and to entrust the surface world to others in place of their wounded selves. They gave people a mysterious power called gifts. Humanity created the Adventurers Guild and the ranking system. The job of adventurers is to continually challenge the monsters living in dungeons so that the ever-increasing monsters don't destroy the dungeons. However, Essen was probably the only one making a living by gathering medicinal herbs. He pulls up various plants from the ground and inspects them. Essen takes a bite of some of the plants. Essen's gift was Monster Eater. He was given that dud gift that only lets him eat anything like a monster without getting sick. He softly laughs at himself, wondering how long he was going to keep doing what he's always done. Sneaking around, running away from mere F-rank monsters, he thought it was pathetic. Looking at the questionable thing in his hand, I honestly don't know if it's one of the plants or some sort or meat. Essen complains that he had another garbage meal that day, but at least it saves his food expenses. He's snapped out of his thoughts when he hears a scream. He hides behind another tree and peeks around it as someone screams for help. A girl sobs on the ground as before her stood a ferocious forest wolf ready to attack. Essen's eyes widened at the huge size of the adult forest wolf. The wolf growls, but when the girl screams for help once more, it lunges for her. It tackles her to the ground. Essen springs up, but he stops short. He was well aware how bad the situation was. He didn't have a gift that let him fight, and there were no other adventurers around. He clenches his fists tight, hoping for someone to come. The girl lets out a soft yell for help. Suddenly, Essen throws his whole body weight into the side of the wolf, effectively moving it away from the girl. The wolf stands a few feet away, waiting for Essen's next move. Glancing at the girl, he tells her to get up and escape. However, the girl apologizes for the large slash on her, making her unable to make a break for it. Essen's face pales at the fight of her wound. The wolf lunges again, now Essen as its target. Completely caught off guard, Essen takes the hit full force. It pushes him to the ground and he's barely able to stop it from biting into him. The woman screams in fear for him. Internally, Essen wonders if it was all ending for him in that F-rank dungeon. Without fulfilling his promise and without achieving his dream, the wolf wildly tries to bite him and Essen struggles to hold it away from him. For a split second, he hears himself think of his devouring gift, angrily asking himself if he was really going to let things end just like that. The wolf gets impossibly closer. He thinks of his gift again. Finally, blood spurts from the battle as someone is bitten. The girl screams, but the wolf is caught off guard and makes a pained sound. Even the wolf is like, "What the hell?" In his bloodied mouth, Essen holds a piece of the wolf's flesh. "Bro, how tough are your teeth? You took a whole chunk from it." Suddenly, a voice rings out in his head. It tells Essen that he had acquired the forest wolf's great fang. Essen freezes. The wolf retreats from Essen and the girl, lurking around them and waiting for its next chance. As Essen wipes the blood from his mouth, his thoughts are in a rush. He had just heard a divine message, the one people had said an adventurer would hear when their gift awakens. But Essen questions why it only activated then. The girl tries to crawl up to him, asking if he was all right. Essen is surprised at her question before hesitantly reassuring her. The wounded wolf grows once more before lunging again. Essen unsheathes a small dagger. As the wolf draws closer, he takes a slash at the wolf, but a loud snap echoes as the wolf takes a bite of it and maneuvers to the side. Essen clicks his tongue as the broken blade of his dagger falls pathetically to the ground close to the wolf. It was no use. A simple dagger like that was no match for its fangs. He needed something harder than a knife. He grits his teeth. But Essen pauses for a second, suddenly remembering the divine message from earlier. He was sure it said that he acquired the forest wolf's great fang. Essen had heard the divine message the moment he bit off the wolf's tongue. OMG, I didn't know he bit off the tongue of all places. I thought he got, like, the bridge of its snout or something. That's nasty. Essen brushes the blood at the corner of his mouth, suddenly excited at the idea. Rather nervously, he figured it was still worth a shot. He orders for his gift to activate. Almost instantaneously, something like a shadowy mask forms over his chin, forming what appeared to be the lower jaw of a wolf with tall fangs. Essen faces the wolf as it lunges for him. Essen takes a large bite out of the side of its head. The wolf drops to the forest floor, blood gushing from its wound. Essen stands over the dead wolf. He looks at it in surprise, unable to quite believe that he was able to defeat it. Slowly, the jaw-like mask over his face disappears. He hears the girl exclaim in amazement and whips his head to look at her. He runs up to her, asking if she was okay, especially with the wound on her leg. The girl reassures him that she was fine. With a bright smile, she genuinely thanks him. Essen pauses before, with a bashful smile, he thinks how he was thanked as an adventurer for the first time. Okay, that's pretty sad considering he's been an adventurer for like 4 years. The girl is rather confused by his reaction. Later on, they sit on the grassy floors next to each other as the girl bandages her wound. She exclaims at how strong he was. Essen introduces himself, adding that he had the title of the Eternal Last Place. His mood suddenly worsens, realizing what he just said. The girl apologizes, admitting that she had just recently converted to being an adventurer, thus unfamiliar with his title. She introduces herself as Yua. Essen asks about her recent conversion, and Yua explains that she was actually a farmer before, but she had some business in the forest. There were several types of gods. For example, those who worship the god of travel are called adventurers, and gain gifts specialized for fighting monsters and the right to enter dungeons. Pretty cool to hear that adventurers are for the god of travel. You'd think people made for fighting in dungeons were under a warrior god or something. Merchants worshipped the god of wealth, farmers the god of agriculture, each bringing appropriate benefits. Yua says that it must be really tough being an adventurer if someone so strong like Essen was in last place. Essen laughs awkwardly. He admits that it was actually the first time he was able to use his gift. Yua exclaims in disbelief. Essen tells her that he might have misunderstood it all that time. He thought his gift, Monster Eater, just meant he could eat anything like a monster, but it looked like he actually needed to eat monsters itself. During the fight, his gift was fully activated when he ate the forest wolf's tongue. Happy he got his gift activated, but that's still disgusting. Yua stays quiet as she listens to his explanation. Yua suggests that it might be that he doesn't get the part of the monster that he ate, but rather the monster's unique ability. Imagine he just ends up with a forest wolf's tongue. Like, what does he even do with it? Essen agrees with her thoughts. However, he thinks how up until then, eating cooked monster meat never triggered a divine message. Even discarded raw meat didn't cause any changes. He supposed that he might still have to eat the meat while it was still alive. He excitedly turns to Yua, declaring that maybe with his current gift he'll finally be able to get stronger. He pauses for a second before asking about what business she had in the forest, his question surprising Yua. Essen suddenly takes back his question, saying that he might have been a little too presumptuous. Yua looks down with a worried frown, seemingly thinking hard about something. Essen gets up with a laugh, saying that someone like him who was in last place most likely wouldn't be any help anyway. Yua softly whispers to herself. Clenching her hands together, she finally makes her choice and calls out his name. She gets up to stand and says that although it may be presumptuous of her since he already helped, she still wanted to ask him a favor. She asks if he would be able to defeat a forest cat for her. I love that the monsters are just animal names with forest tacked before each name. Essen is caught off guard by her request. Yua explains that she desperately needed the mushroom that grew on the forest cat's head, but she didn't have the money to post a collection request. Since she couldn't do it with her own strength, she begs him for the only cure to her mother's infectious disease. Essen tells her to wait a minute, remembering that forest cats were the strongest monsters in that forest. A silence passes between them. Finally, Essen turns his head away and softly says that he couldn't. Yua flinches. Essen apologizes for asking about her situation. He admits that his body had moved on its own during the fight, and if he was quite honest, he simply got lucky. He apologetically says that he couldn't suddenly take on such a strong enemy. Another pause passes between them. Finally, Yua speaks first. Forcing out a smile, Yua tells him that she understood and she apologizes for asking too much. With that, she turns around and staggers deeper into the forest. Left alone, Essen looks at the sky. The blurred-out image of another girl comes to mind. She asks him if his decision was truly fine with him. Essen doesn't say anything, stuck in place. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Yua trudges on. She holds a large stick close to her chest as a weapon. Shaking and with tears in her eyes, she thinks about her mother and how she needed to do something. Suddenly, she's startled by a loud voice calling out her name. It was Essen, breathing hard as he ran to catch up to her. Yua is surprised to see him, but as he reaches her, Essen immediately apologizes to her for being wrong. Catching his breath, he tells her that he would defeat the forest cat for her. He admits that he didn't know if he could do it, and Yua cuts him off, saying that because of her sudden and selfish request, he would be put in danger. Essen determinedly argues that back then, he'd been using his gift as an excuse to run away, but right then he wanted to stop doing that. To be fair, as far as he was aware before, his gift was to eat questionable things without getting killed. Props to him for standing on business. Clenching his fists, he says that if he doesn't, the person he admired would laugh at him. Yua stares at him, still in tears but also touched. With a grin, Essen tells her to wait in a safe place. Yua breaks into full sobbing, thanking Essen wholeheartedly. Later on, Yua is left alone, wiping away her tears. She thinks about how Essen was probably scared too, but he still accepted her selfish request. She hurriedly looked around, wondering if there was anything she could do to help. Suddenly, she spots small footprints on the forest floor. Yua springs into action, resolute that she just couldn't rely on Essen completely. Meanwhile, in a cave hidden in the forest, a creature with mushrooms growing on its head raises its head, ears twitching. The forest cat watches the entrance to the cave. Its eyes focus on the newcomer. Essen carefully makes his way into the cave. Of course, he knew where the cat's den had been since he had been coming to the F-rank dungeon for 4 years. He presses his lips together, eyes sharp in focus. Thinking how there was no way he was moving up to a higher rank without defeating the cat anyway, Essen takes on a fighting stance as he challenges the cat. Essen decides to make the first strike. He lunges for the cat with a makeshift knife. Once he's close enough, he swipes at the air with his weapon. However, his attack misses the cat, his enemy no longer where he thought it was supposed to be. He looks up in a panic to find the cat glaring at him from its place in the ceiling. With a growl, its claws start to glow. When the light disappeared, its claws had gotten longer and sharper. Essen braces himself for the attack. The cat releases itself from the ceiling and slashes at Essen, but he's able to dodge it just in time. The cat's claws destroy the ground where it hits. Essen clenches his teeth, annoyed at the forest cat's speed and strong claws. He summons his abilities from the forest wolf, and a shadow-like jaws cover half his face. He lunges at the cat again, trying to bite at it, but the cat runs away just in time once more. The cat leaps onto a cliff, meowing at Essen. He grunts. Even with his fangs, he couldn't keep up with the forest cat's speed. Before he knew it, the cat was covered by a brilliant light as it ran towards him. It deals multiple blows to Essen, who barely manages to hold off from falling over but still earns multiple wounds. The cat had gotten even faster. He skids back with each hit. Essen curses as he's being toyed with. He makes an attempt to slash at the cat, but his attack backfires when the cat deals him a blow to the back. He looks around in a rush. Essen couldn't believe that the forest cat was only an F-rank monster. The forest cat swings its claws, slashes of air heading to Essen. He barely dodges the attack, but it breaks the ground all around him into rubble. He wonders if he had prepared better, if he could have fought more properly. He dodges again, his thoughts running wildly. He asks what he needed to defeat the monster. He needed to think of some way to break through and do something about the cat's speed. Suddenly, a figure breathing heavily arrives through the forest entrance. The person calls out to him. He turns to find Yua asking in a frenzy what she was doing there. The sudden arrival catches the attention of the forest cat. Yua answers in a rush that she thought she might be able to help Essen, and so she caught a forest rabbit for him. She throws the unconscious animal his way. Essen successfully catches it. Seeing that it was still alive, he remembers that a forest rabbit was known for its leg strength. Hoping that it doesn't just give him big ears or something similar, that would be fun to witness, not gonna lie, Essen immediately takes a bite out of it. The forest cat rushes for him once more, claws outstretched. Suddenly, a shadow-like smoke swallows Essen whole. The forest cat reaches him and swings, but Essen disappears. A familiar voice in his head tells him that he acquired the forest rabbit's swift legs. Both the forest cat and Yua look up to see Essen hanging from the ceiling of the cave. I'm pretty sure that his head crashed right into the ceiling, actually. Essen switches positions, looking up at the forest cat that remained on the ground. He thanks Yua before diving back down. Essen summons the wolf's great fangs again. Just as the forest cat had done to him earlier, he quickly bounces around it, trapping the terrified monster in place. Oh, now I feel bad. Look how scared it looks, Lamau. Finally, with one last lunge, Essen takes a bit off of its neck. Yua gapes in amazement. Essen slows to a stop as the dead forest cat falls to the floor. His abilities gradually fade. With a smile, he thanked Yua for the meal. That's a nasty way to put it, bro. Suddenly, Yua tackles Essen from behind. She exclaims that he was amazing for really defeating the forest cat. Essen gasps in shock at the sudden attack. Their eyes meet, Essen's face going completely red. Realizing what she just did, Yua immediately lets go, apologizing and reasoning that she just got too happy. Essen's heart is going a mile a minute. Poor guy is gonna die from a heart attack at this point. Changing the subject and ignoring her own embarrassment, Yua asks what gift he got from the cat. Essen realizes that she was right. He tells her that he thinks he heard the voice say something about sharp claws. Just as he raises his hands, his nails get longer just like the forest cat's. What they didn't expect, however, was that the length of his nails would stretch to the very ceiling. Both he and Yua stare up with gaping mouths. Yua laughs, teasing Essen that Monster Eater was difficult to control. Essen turns away, blushing, arguing back that since it was all still new to him, he should be cut some slack. He retracts his nails from the ceiling. After that, they cut the large mushroom from the forest cat's head. He hands the mushroom to Yua, as promised. Yua bows to him, saying that she would surely repay him for the favor someday. Essen reassures her that there was no need for thanks in the first place, because he wouldn't have even won without her. Yua grins at him. As they head out of the cave, Essen asks Yua not to tell anyone about his gift. Seeing as how people only thought of monsters as enemies of the people, if his ability gets out, he might get bullied. I think they might actually burn you at a stake, bro. Yua laughs, thinking that it really would have been troublesome. She smiles and says that she understands, but she would never forget her debt. Essen tells her to hurry back to her mother, waving goodbye. Yua thanks him one last time before bidding him farewell. Essen was still the eternal last place, but he felt like he's finally reached the starting line as an adventurer. In his head, he challenges Polaris and even adventurers he hasn't met yet. Looking determined up at the sky, Essen declares that he was definitely going to become #1 in the rankings. Meanwhile, in the Adventurer Rankings board, Essen's rank, which has been 96,743 for the past 4 years, finally moves up to 90,000. A person steps into the guild hall, their presence making people turn heads. Adventurers move away as a girl passes by without turning to any of them, despite the others recognizing her. The adventurers stare in shock and awe at Ice Princess Polaris. They burst into excited whispers as they watch her retreating back, unable to believe that she was back already. Her last dungeon, the Volcano of Destruction, was supposedly a high difficulty dungeon even for those with an A rank. Polaris stops in front of the Adventurer Rankings board, eyes scanning the numbers. She finds her name, still in 9th place. She thinks to herself that things really were just as she expected. She didn't think it would be easy to rise in her current rank bracket. Her thoughts are halted when a female adventurer beside her falls to the ground wailing. Other adventurers rush to try and help her up, unsure what was going on. The girl screams as she scans the Adventurer Rankings. She's unable to find a man's name on the board, which was there until the other day. She hysterically asks anyone if they know who she was talking about. However, they all turn to a newcomer. The newcomer says that it was most likely some sort of weak adventurer ranked lower than the 1000 bracket and that it happened all the time. The newcomer, a rather extravagant-looking man, smirks and laughs mockingly as he says that there were only 2 ways to remove a name from the rankings. Either quitting being an adventurer or dying, well, that sounds fun. Polaris recognizes the man, calling him Wellness. That's quite the choice for an adventurer name. Wellness then casually brushes off the conversation, telling Polaris that it wasn't something they needed to worry about. Changing the subject, Wellness compliments Polaris on her beauty before arrogantly advising her that they ignore the low rankers and inviting her for tea. Bro sounds like he doesn't have a lot of friends if that's how he talks to people. Polaris turns away, plainly telling him that she didn't need something like that. Wellness keeps going even as Polaris moves to leave. He suggests that since he was rank 73, it would be beneficial for them to form a party. He comments that he found her quite reserved. Polaris turns back to him and coldly says that it was because Wellness was weaker than her. Oh, damn, she ain't messing around. Offended, Wellness looks away first, angrily calling her a battle maniac who relies only on her gift. What else is she supposed to rely on? It's been working out for her for this long anyway. Polaris exhales softly before turning back around. Her eyes find their way back to the adventurer rankings. They scan down to the very bottom and Polaris freezes. Essen's name was gone from its place at the very bottom. Polaris's face morphs into panic as she looks over the names over and over. She's in complete disbelief. She knew the Essen that had used to protect her when they were children, and she knew that he wasn't one to give up easily. Her thoughts continue to spiral to the worst-case scenario, but then she stops. There in the 90,000th rank was Essen's name. A sense of clarity comes over Polaris at the sight. Without saying anything else, she turns away from the adventurer ranking board and leaves. Pretty sure she just went through the first 4 stages of the 5 stages of grief before she saw his name. Unknown to her, Wellness had been watching her. Later on, Essen makes his way to the adventurer ranking board and exclaims in delight. Other adventurers turn their heads towards him, confused at his sudden outburst. A passing female adventurer warns eternal last place Essen to not suddenly shout because he was bothering everyone. But Essen excitedly announced that his ranking had just gone up. Essen smiles smugly in the background as the adventurers close by point at disbelief at the adventurer ranking board. The adventurers around him start to burst into conversation, but not for what he thought. They ask him what kind of underhanded methods he used. One of them says that he was still at the 90,000th place. Another says it was actually easy to rise since all it took was to defeat a few monsters. Essen's proud smile slowly starts to slip off until finally someone says that there was no need to brag about something like his small rise in rank, because he probably just overtook inactive adventurers. With that, he curls up in a corner under the stairs, completely dejected. The adventurers gathered together earlier slowly dispersed, saying that if he was going to make a fuss over something like that, then he wasn't going to make it far. A more senior adventurer tells Essen that he's been without achievements for so long so his evaluation won't change quickly. Hesitantly laughing, Essen agrees with his words. He picks himself off the ground and forces himself to be more optimistic, thanking the older adventurer for putting him down so he can work harder without getting cocky. That's definitely one way to stay humble. The adventurer smiles at his positivity with a snort. Essen starts planning what to do next as the adventurers leave him be. In Essen's case, due to the nature of his gift, he should be going to various dungeons, but he's only been to the same place so he wasn't very familiar with others. At times like that, the guild counter was the place to go. The girl at the counter greets Essen with a bright smile. She apologizes for making him wait and introduces herself as Eruru. Internally, Essen exclaims how cute Eruru was. Unlike adventurers, guild staff women were gentle and intellectual. Essen tells her that since he wanted to go to an E-rank dungeon, he was looking for some recommendations. Eruru smiles warmly and tells him to wait for a second. Essen thinks that guild staff women were kind and gentle even to bottom feeders like him. They were beautiful. But according to Essen's research, although I have no idea why you would even look into that, Eruru was especially more beautiful. As she passes, Essen inhales and enjoys how she smells nice, bro. Please don't go around sniffing people. People already look at you weird. As she looks through the guild maps, Eruru turns and asks if he was indeed Essen. He's surprised, asking her if he already introduced himself. Eruru explains that he was simply famous in the lower guild. That's definitely one way to be famous. Essen laughs awkwardly and understanding, but Eruru continues that that was the reason she was so surprised when she saw the rankings that morning. She praises him, telling him that she was glad his efforts have been paid off. Touched at the thought, Essen thinks how truly wonderful she was. He wholeheartedly thanks her, but she suddenly tells him that the time when he's about to move forward is when he's most likely to let his guard down. She makes sure to thoroughly warn him. Essen grins and gives her a thumbs up. Eruru smiles at his response before laying down multiple sheets of paper on the table as they go back to their main topic. For beginners, there was the Cemetery of Rest. Quite the funny title, considering if I hear cemetery, I'm pretty sure I would immediately think that resting is the main purpose. Calling it like that now sounds sarcastic, lol. In that dungeon, the slow-moving undead monsters there are safe to deal with. Popular places like the Yellow Earth Underground Passage have relics left behind, so an adventurer like Essen could get some income. The Wandering Cave has rare materials, however Eruru warns him that it might be tough to do solo. Essen looks over the files of the dungeons. He didn't feel like eating the undead, and I would sure hope so because that's disgusting. Essen also wanted to avoid more popular places or ones that couldn't be cleared. Essen asks Eruru if there was a place that wasn't too popular. Eruru thinks hard about it before shuffling through the stack of paper in her hands and handing one to Essen. Rainy Wetlands. In there was less competition. The monsters are standard. And the materials found there are in short supply, so they sell for higher prices. That's pretty weird. Considering how good it sounds, it's strange that it's less popular. Essen smiles at the information and decides on going for the wetlands. Essen tells Eruru that he was glad that he came to consult with her, and she encourages him to come by any time, adding that she would even give him more materials. Waving goodbye, Essen thanks her one final time and Eruru wishes him good luck. Later on, a figure passes through the barrier at an incredible speed. Suddenly, the large and shadowy rabbit-foot slides to a stop. Essen looks around as he arrives at the E-rank dungeon, the Rainy Wetlands. Essen continues to walk through a rather thick fog. Unable to see the murky swamp water, he accidentally falls into the pool of dark water. He crawls out and looks at his drenched feet in disgust. He finally understood why it wasn't a popular place to visit. I forgot he loses his shoes when he activates the Forest Rabbit skill, so I thought the swamp water fully melted his footwear lol. Just as he stands up, Essen notices something at the edge of the water. Even though the wetlands weren't popular, Essen still found it exciting to see so many new materials for the first time. He picks and plucks odd-looking shrubs and pushes them into his new magic bag. A magic bag was a magical tool with an expanded internal space. He was able to get one in exchange for the forest cat materials. Essen was enjoying the idea of using the bag to gather more items, but suddenly something long and fast darts by him. Something thick and slimy entangles itself around his neck, trying to strangle him. Essen looks around in a panic and finds a wetland frog, its tongue pining him down. The frog had poison, however, in the Rainy Wetlands. It was also by far the weakest enemy. Essen summons the claws he got from the forest cat, and with a crossed slash, he cuts the frog's tongue down into multiple pieces. Seeing its tongue in parts at the ground, the wetlands frog makes a run for it. Essen tries to give chase but eventually decides against it. Picking up one of the pieces of the frog's tongue, that's disgusting. Essen focuses on his goal to expand his gift. He puts the piece of tongue up to his mouth and eats as he thinks proudly that he was doing pretty well. A voice rings out in his head that he obtained the wetland frog's whip tongue. Eventually, he finishes his meal, casually cleaning his mouth. That's unimaginably nasty. Just then, Essen's throat constricts painfully. He claws at his throat, confused and dreading what was happening to him. Before he knew it, he was foaming at the mouth. He curses over and over at the pain. He grabs at his burning throat to no avail. As he's forced to his knees, he drops the magic bag. He makes a rush to rummage through the bag in a panic as he's slowly unable to breathe. Finding what he was looking for, he takes out a large vial of potion. He downs all the contents as soon as possible, only taking a breath once he is finished. Breathing heavily, he softly reprimands himself for letting his guard down. He's thankful he prepared an antidote, seeing now that Monster Eater couldn't neutralize poison. Essen comes to the conclusion that gifts weren't omnipotent and he sighs, saying how Eruru's warning was spot on. Finding the E-rank dungeon quite a formidable challenge, Essen grins in determination. Time passes with Essen carrying on in the wetlands. As he walks, he's unaware of a certain wetland frog following him around before ducking away. Essen looks down at one of the info sheets for the Rainy Wetlands monsters. He wanted to get powerful abilities if possible. However, if they were too strong, he wouldn't be able to defeat them. Not only that, he was already out of antidotes, so he needed to eat meat that was safe to be consumed. Turning to his side, he suddenly crouches to the ground as he sees familiar creatures on the other side of the rock formations and murky pool of water. It was a wetland lizard. Seeing as it had no poison and it was expected for him to get some useful skills like its scales, Essen rushed in using his forest rabbit legs. He also summons his forest wolf fangs as he tries to go in for the first strike for the win. One of the wetland lizards notices him. Essen decides on using his new skill and he opens his shadowy jaws for a long tongue to come out. His wetland frog tongue stretches out and reaches for the lizard. It tangles itself around the lizard's body. Essen ends up being pulled over to the lizard. As he does so, he goes in to bite at the monster's body, but his teeth don't sink in all the way, and the lizard remains mostly unaffected by his attack. Well, this is awkward. Essen panics at the unexpected strength of its scales. Eventually, another lizard notices him. Using its tail, it slams Essen away from its companion. Essen and his frog's tongue are forced to let go and he goes flying. The lizards are angered, the one that Essen attacked even more so, as it had a noticeable wound where he bit down. Essen was able to rip out a part of its scales. He sits up, and using the forest wolf's fangs, he chomps down on the scales and swallows. A voice tells him that he was able to obtain the wetland lizard's blade tail. Essen immediately summons it out. He takes a battle stance, almost all his skills out in the open. Threatened, the lizards hiss at him. Essen, remembering that their tails sold for a high price, decided that he needed to defeat the lizards properly. The lizards rush in and Essen meets it halfway. They crash into one another. All three bounce off from the other due to the impact. Essen's eyes brighten in exhilaration and as he has fun. He could feel himself getting stronger both in gift and physical abilities every time he ate a monster. He was able to become even stronger. He stretches out his frog's tongue. It wraps itself around the dead tree trunk behind the lizards. Essen whips around using his tongue like a rope and pulling himself closer to the lizards at an amazing speed. Before the monsters could react, Essen is pulled over and slashes down at one of the lizards using his forest cat claws. The other lizard is caught by surprise. Its panic spikes and immediately decides to run away. It turns around to make sure that Essen wasn't chasing after it. But as it faces in front, Essen is already there. A daggered tail springs out for an attack. Essen's tail cleanly goes through the lizard. With a cough of blood, the lizard goes down. Essen pumps his fist in the air at his victory as his shadowy skills slowly fade back away. Pulling his hood up, he decides with a content sigh that he was going to call it a day. Set out on a blanket, he was able to get a lot of materials too, even better than he expected. The sun had begun to set back in the city. People of all sorts walk and run down the busy streets. Essen hums happily to himself as he walks. He was able to get a lot of money from selling materials. Maybe he could even get some good meat on his way home that night. It also wouldn't be bad to buy necessary materials for the future. However, he suddenly remembers that above all, he needed a pair of pants. Unfortunately, he didn't notice during the fight, but his new tail skill had torn through his pants, making him wonder why he felt rather cold, bro. You should have known that would happen when your rabbit legs straight up destroyed your shoes the first time. Right now, here in the city as he walked the streets, he only had a dark piece of cloth tied around his waist and covering his backside. In other words, right now, he is half-ass Essen. I'm happy to know that he has the heart to make quality jokes about himself. He starts walking faster down the street, focused on getting to a clothing store as quickly as possible. It would be bad if he ran into someone he knew. You just jinxed it. Almost immediately, dust is kicked up and the air glitters as a figure appears, calling out his name. Essen completely freezes up. Pun not intended. His thoughts spiral, hoping that it wasn't the right voice, but they call for his name again. Behind a rather distressed Essen was an awkwardly standing Polaris. She meekly congratulates him. Standing properly, she tells him that she saw that his ranking had gone up. Essen starts to turn around instinctively, ready to speak to her, but he holds himself back just in time, clenching his teeth. He keeps his back turned to her as she praises him for his hard work, although she didn't know what he did. Polaris was a high-ranking adventurer, and Essen believed that there was no reason for her to come to the lower district. He grits his teeth. He had thought that she had long forgotten about him, but now he wonders if she still thought about him. He raises his head, trying to keep his tears in check as he calls himself pathetic. He roughly brushes at his eyes. Polaris carries on, hopefully suggesting that since he was able to fight now then they should form a party together. But almost immediately she's cut off as Essen turns her down, brother. That's way too harsh. Repeating himself, Essen tells Polaris that he couldn't do that, much to her shock. With clenched fists, he explains that he knew that his ranking would easily go up if he formed a party with her. Polaris stays quiet as she listens. Essen continues that that wasn't the kind of adventurer he wanted to be. It was selfish and petty pride, but Essen determinedly tells her that he would definitely climb up the rankings on his own. Polaris ends up smiling fondly regardless, calling him selfish and how he hasn't changed at all. Essen has the same fond smile. Breathing deeply, there's a pause before Polaris says that she understood and she would wait. With a bright smile, she says that she would wait for Essen. Essen holds a thumbs up in the air for her, and Polaris smiles once more as she turns around. The air sparkles once more as she teleports away. Finally, Essen turns around to see the last of her magic. Essen clenches his fists again as he's feeling even more motivated, determined to prepare for the next day. Just as he turns back around to leave, he bumps onto someone's shoulder. He rushes to apologize, but the other person doesn't say anything. As Essen leaves in a hurry, the man he ran into carries a smug smirk. Casually brushing his shoulder free of invisible dust, Wellness scoffs in understanding as he looks at where Essen had just ran off to. Meanwhile, Essen finally finds a clothing store to buy pants from. Words cannot describe how glad I am that he kept those on the whole conversation with Polaris. Meanwhile, in the A-rank dungeon Thunder Peak, Polaris rushes at a demon-like monster with a rapier. Casting her skill Iceburn, a powerful wave of snow passes through, freezing everything on sight. The demon monster roars in anger, getting caught in the snow and rendering it frozen. With a jab of her rapier, Polaris casts Icicle Lance. The attack impales the monster, its frozen body cracking into pieces. Polaris waits for a second before smiling in victory. Her victory is cut short when lightning suddenly strikes. She jumps away just as the strike hits the spot where she stood. Polaris's eyes widen at the sight of a flying and glowing creature called a lightning worm. It looks more like a Chinese dragon in my opinion, or maybe a catfish. The monster leers down at her as Polaris successfully lands on solid ground. She runs as more strikes of lightning rain down on her. As she dodges, Polaris thinks about how she had already encountered more than 20 monsters. As expected from a dungeon in its flood season, her enemies just kept on coming. However, when she gains enough distance, she turns around to face the monster with her weapon pointed at it with both hands on the hilt. Her eyes are closed as the lightning worm nears. When she senses its presence is close enough, she casts her ultimate skill, Permafrost. Later on, Polaris walks beside a woman in a small village in the mountain regions. The woman thanks her for calming the monster's rage every year. She hopes that it stays peaceful for a while. Polaris smiles softly and replies that she wasn't exactly interested in monster ecology. As she turns away with a wave of goodbye, she tells the woman that all she did was keep defeating monsters. She leaves the mountain region. Although Polaris had said she would wait for Essen, she had no plans on staying still. Meanwhile, in a way station, Essen makes his way over to one of the traveling porters and asks to take a carriage to the port town of Leubel. The porter, seeing that he was an adventurer, tells him that they were leaving soon so he could hop onto the carriage right there and wait. Essen thanks the man. It had been a week since his reunion with Polaris. He's been frequenting the rainy wetlands and gained lots of skills. However, he thought it was about time to start venturing even further. Essen makes his way over to the carriage, pushing back the curtain to get inside, and finds another passenger sitting at the very back. The other passenger stares at him with sharp eyes. As Essen takes a seat in the carriage, the man smirks as he calls Essen by his eternal last place title. At this point, we just know that if someone calls him that, things are not going to go well. The carriage leaves the way station and journeys forward. Essen frowns as he stares the man down. Internally, he thinks how rude the man was for a first meeting. Catching his stare, the man proudly introduces himself as Keith, before Essen interjects that he didn't ask. Essen makes it a point to tell Keith that he wasn't in last place anymore. However, Keith just scoffs and shrugs him off, saying that it made no difference from his perspective. Essen's frown deepens as he wonders if Keith's rank was really just that high. Essen gives Keith a once-over, taking note of his well-worn equipment and the aura he seems to give off. Seeing the way he was looking at him, Keith defensively says that being an E rank was tough. Essen awkwardly asks if they were on the same level. Keith scoffs and tells Essen not to lump him in the same place as the eternal last place. He haughtily adds that it was merely advice for weaklings to come home. Finally, Essen has had enough. Yeah bro, go fight for yourself. Keith is surprised when Essen suddenly says to stop with his eternal last place nonsense already. We can play a drinking game with the amount of times Keith calls Essen that way. Essen tells him that his title wasn't his name. Keith basically shrugs off his words, pompously saying that Essen was quite ungrateful for someone's kindness. Calling him Pessin instead, Keith challenges him to show that he was worthy of rising above. Essen takes on his challenge, although he really didn't have a reason to prove anything to Keith. Keith smirks at him. The carriage stops, and the porter from before lifts the curtain of the carriage to let them know that they had arrived. Essen stands up excitedly. He jumps off the carriage with a yell, exclaiming that it had been a while since he traveled that far. Keith exits right behind him, commenting that he was acting like such a kid. Essen replies that he just couldn't help it since he didn't travel much before. Essen turns to the side and exclaims at the sight of the wide sea. Essen's smile is wiped off his face when Keith calls him Pessin again. Essen corrects him, but he asks what Keith wanted nonetheless. Keith haughtily tells him not to say his name so casually before asking Essen if he planned on heading to the dungeon immediately. Essen threatens to beat him up, but he tells Keith that he was going to at least check it out. Asking what Keith's plans were, the sharp-eyed man laughs mockingly that, unlike Essen, he had the luxury of starting his conquest the next day. Essen rolls his eyes and blocks out the rest of what he was going to say. Essen really did meet quite a strange guy. Time passes and waves crash into the side of rocks at the seabed as Essen arrives at the E-rank dungeon, Roaring Reef. Eruru had told him about a not-so-popular dungeon spot once more. Punching his fist into his palm, Essen smiles at the idea that he would be able to acquire new skills to his heart's content and earn some pocket money from subjugation requests. He starts to stretch his muscles. Unpopular dungeons regularly received subjugation requests. If the endlessly spawning monsters exceed the acceptable limit, the barrier could break, causing a disaster called overflow that attacks people. Essen leaps up the rocks and lands on a cliffside. The rewards are generous to make up for the lack of popularity. This time it was the subjugation of 3 leaf crabs. Looking down at a group of leaf crabs swimming about in shallow water, Essen remembers hearing about how monsters nearly destroyed the neighboring village when he was a kid. Beyond rankings and rewards to prevent such things from happening, Essen decides on taking subjugation jobs like that occasionally. Essen summons out his tail he received from the wetland lizards. One of the leaf crabs looks up in alarm as something closes distance. With a resounding snap, Essen throws the full force of his tail on the crab, but his tail bounces back. He exclaims at the hardness of its shell. The crab's eyes follow him past its cracked shell. Just as Essen lands on his feet, the crab prepares to attack. With a swift slash of its pincers, it swipes at Essen. But Essen dodges in time, throwing himself into the air, and the crab's pincers cut the large rock behind him into two. Essen's face goes pale seeing what happened to the rocks. He lands back on his feet some distance away. Essen is horrified, unable to believe that the leaf crab only had the attack power of an E rank. The crab seems to mock him, motioning its claw towards him. Essen grins at the challenge. He wonders if maybe he had gotten used to being underestimated, but he was already used to that kind of thing. Going back to the fight, he lunges for the crab. The weakness of a crustacean monster was their belly and their relatively slow forward and backward movement. Essen clenches his fist, his daggered tail following close behind. Hitting it from underneath, he deals an uppercut that topples the crab onto its back. Essen smiles. After all, once they were flipped over, they wouldn't be able to do anything. The crab's legs frantically scuttle in the air, but that was it. He grabs onto one of the crab's legs before summoning out one of the forest cat's claws to cut the leg off. He exerts some effort in doing so since even the base was hard. He eventually cuts it off. The insides were full of pure white crab meat. He takes a bite. Immediately he exclaims at how delicious it was. Firm, elastic meat texture, rich broth aroma, and the natural sweetness perfectly matches the sea-derived saltiness. Essen suddenly stops short, thinking that if he started his own seafood restaurant specializing in crab dishes, he might possibly dominate in the field. His thoughts are suddenly consumed with the image of Polaris and how they could possibly run the place together. That's quite the imagination, bro. Try inviting Rank 9 to retire and start a seafood resto LOL. He suddenly slaps his hands over his head and calls himself an idiot. Filled with determination once more, he reminds himself that his dream wasn't to be #1 in the restaurant rankings. Picking up the leaf crab parts over his shoulder, he reprimands himself and says that with such wavering resolve, he would never be able to catch up with Polaris time passes. Essen ends up in the seaside town and decides on looking for a decently cheap inn. He's stopped in his tracks at the smell of delicious soup. The scent makes him turn to a building called Coral Inn. He opens the door and the man at the front counter asks him if he was an adventurer staying over for the night. Essen says yes and that he would like to stay for about 5 days. The man offers to let him stay for as long as he likes and Essen thanks him. Suddenly, he hears the loud voice of a child exclaiming at their older brother. A man in the building boasts that he was the strongest adventurer, and he came to the region's dungeon for reasons, but mostly it was merely a detour. This can't be good. The man turned out to be Keith, boasting to a young boy, showing off his bandaged arm. Keith tells the boy that it was the scars befitting a strong warrior known as Keith of the Scorching Sun. The boy exclaims at the coolness of Keith having his own title. Watching this all happen in front of him, Essen wears a complicated expression like a mix of cringe and disbelief. Just as Keith raises his spoon to take a sip of his soup, he notices Essen's presence. Pointing to Essen using his spoon, he tells the child to look at his underling who just arrived late. Essen glares at his words. The boy's eyes sparkle at the idea of Keith having an underling, kid. You shouldn't believe everything some stranger tells you. Walking closer to their table, Essen asks Keith what he was doing, to which the dark-haired adventurer sarcastically replies saying he was having dinner. Barely hiding his anger, Essen says that wasn't what he meant and he was referring to Keith feeding children lies. Leaning back on his seat with a smirk, Keith says that if Essen's ranking was still lower than his at 70,000th, then it was all the same to him. Calling him underling big bro? Oh, that's about to do numbers on a man's ego. Almost worse than the eternal last place, the boy asks Essen what his ranking was and if he had a title. Essen hesitantly answers that he was around 76,000 and slowly lies that he had no title. Keith doesn't let him escape, however, and asks if Essen had already abandoned his title as the eternal last place. Take a shot. Essen asks if he was allowed to cry now. Keith grins mockingly, saying that if Essen wanted to lecture him, he should first surpass him. Essen has no reply to his goading, just quietly crying at the harsh reality. Softly cursing, he mutters how he was already working hard to get stronger as of late. Keith doesn't take too kindly to his words, scoffing and saying that his efforts were nothing. With a harsh glare, he says Essen might be getting cocky because he had luckily began rising in rank. But for Keith, he still knew him as the one who used to laugh off insults with a grin. Standing up, he admits that he despised Essen's true nature. Essen clenches his teeth in anger. When Keith passes by him, he places a hand on Essen's shoulder and tells him that for someone without achievements, he only told him a fair assessment. Keith shrugs on his worn-down cloak and leaves the building. Essen watches him go, still rather angry, while the boy at the table is in awe. Later that night, as Essen lies down in bed, he frowns and curses at himself for being unable to retort to whatever Keith said about him. Bro, I don't think you could have said anything that would have gotten through that thick skull of his. Suddenly, there's a knock at his door and Essen gets up to let the person in. Opening the door, the boy from before greets him with a wide grin. The boy introduces himself as Nick, son of the owner of the inn. He asks for Essen's name and Essen introduces himself. Nick asks if he wanted breakfast prepared since his dad was asking. Essen agrees before commending Nick for helping around the inn. Showing the mop in his hands, Nick proudly tells Essen that he was saving up his allowance to buy a sword, and after that he would be able to conquer dungeons. Essen smiles and praises him for his dream. Essen fondly thinks how he was once like that as well. Using the mop to slash at the air, Nick announces that he would quickly surpass underling Big Bro, which was Essen and other adventurers. With a laugh, Essen says that he can't fall behind either. Suddenly, Nick says that he wouldn't lose either, especially not to a low-ranking big brother without a title like Essen. Essen clicks his tongue, taking mental damage at the boy's words. Clenching his fists, Essen thinks of how in his world, ranking truly was everything. Numbers were the sole indicator and strength determines one's worth. That was why adventurers aimed for the top. Essen reminds himself that someday he would surpass Keith and eventually Polaris. The night passes and it's another day at Leubel. As Essen eats, he catches sight of a man ready to leave the establishment, thanking the owner for the meal. Quickly downing his meal, Essen goes to leave as well, thanking the owner for his breakfast as he exits. As Keith walks, he hears someone call out his name. He stops and turns. He sees Pessin calling for him and continues walking. Essen catches up to him and starts to correct him about his name before deciding against it and says that since Keith was heading over to the dungeon, he asks if he's allowed to join him on the journey. Keith grunts, but he lets Essen follow him anyway. As they walk side by side, Essen smiles at him and thanks him for the other day. He tells Keith that even if he was in good form, he still had a long way to go, and so he preferred that kind of treatment to being fawned over. Bro is a better person than I because that patience level is truly something. Keith smiles, happy at the sudden praise, and says it was only natural for the strong to advise the weak. Essen laughs that it wasn't exactly advice. As they walk, adventurers pulling a large cart behind them pass by. Inside the cart were multiple leaf crabs tied up. Keith and Essen watch the cart pass by. Keith comments that he's never heard of anyone taking the crabs in alive, and Essen comments that maybe there was someone with a hypnosis gift in the group of adventurers. Since some of them were used as ingredients, Essen suggests that maybe fresher ones fetched a higher price. Keith agrees, but his voice slowly dies off as his sharp eyes linger on the cart. Eventually, Essen and Keith arrive at the dungeon. Essen points to one side of the dungeon, letting Keith know that he was heading over there since they both went solo. Keith is confused at his words, thinking that the idea was understood since there was no benefit for him to team up with Essen. Essen frowns at him, reprimanding him that he didn't have to say it in the way he did. But before Keith leaves, he tells him to call out if something happened to him. Essen lets out a half-hearted, exasperated sigh, and so he starts his dungeon diving for the day. A monstrous creature with lots of teeth shrilly screams in intimidation, but its squeals are cut short when Essen summons out a large pincer and grabs onto the monster. He screams in effort as he uses the pincer to cut the monster's thick tentacle-like body parts. Rushing in, Essen takes a bite out of the monster. The great pincer he got from the leaf crab was incredibly powerful. He leaps into the air and like a falling lance, he impales the monster. Essen stands back straight, forcing his pincers away. Essen was sure he had just battled a leaf star. He kneels down, wondering out loud to himself what kind of skill he would get from the leaf star, when someone suddenly yells in pain. Essen immediately gets up, recognizing Keith's voice. He makes a run for it to where he was supposed to be. He catches sight of Keith, curled up on the ground and surrounded by smoke. When Essen nears him, he stops short in horror as the smoke clears. Keith grits his teeth in pain. He holds onto his left arm, which was completely burnt. Essen walks closer to Keith. In a worried voice, he asks about Keith's burnt hand, wondering if he was attacked by a monster. Keith is surprised by his presence. With a smirk and a scoff, he says no. Instead, he points to a burnt monster's body behind him and tells Essen that if he was Keith's opponent, he would be the burnt body floating on the shallow water. Looking closer, it was the burnt body of a leaf crab. Essen is shocked and in awe. Internally, he thinks that even with his gift, he couldn't have broken through the leaf crab head-in, but Keith was able to burn it to a crisp. As he wonders what kind of gift Keith had, Keith pulls out a potion from his bag. He uncorks the bottle with his mouth before splashing his arm with the liquid. As Essen wordlessly watches Keith's hand heal, Keith explains that his gift was called Scorching Sun. It was a gift that allowed him to create flames. That's kinda badass, not gonna lie. Simple, but definitely effective. Heavily breathing from the pain, Keith asks if Essen was jealous, adding that it was a gift befitting of him, who was destined to be the strongest. Essen frowns and internally thinks that gifts that manipulate elements were rare and versatile, so he could see why Keith called himself the strongest. Do agree that it explains the ego. Essen turns to Keith's hand, which was slowly healing. He asks Keith if he got burnt like that every time he used his gift, but Keith shrugs his concern away, saying that it couldn't be helped. Essen argues that the cost of burn medicine must be ridiculous, adding that waiting for his body to recover each time would be inefficient. Keith argues back that it was the fate of the strong. Rather confused, Essen asks him what his reason was for being an adventurer if he had to go through all that. He thought that the drawbacks were way too big. Finally having enough of his questions, Keith repeats his answer. There's a pause between them. Keith glares at the ground and declares that he would become the strongest. An image comes to his mind of a child in the middle of the ruins of a village. Determinedly, he says again that he had to become the strongest. He walks away from Essen. As he watches Keith's retreating back, Essen thinks of Keith sacrificing his body in exchange for strength over and over again. No matter how strong he looked, Essen knew he would always reach his limit. He wonders how Keith planned on becoming the strongest if he continued to stay as is. Suddenly, a couple of men pass by in a hurry, yelling that the town was done for. As they pass by Essen, he hears them plan on hurrying up and informing the travel god church. Ethan and Keith watch as they pick up the pace and leave. Suddenly, they hear someone call for them. It was a young child's voice calling for his big brothers. Essen immediately recognizes the child as Nick. He stops running in front of them, and in a rush, Essen asks what was wrong. Breathing heavily, Nick informs them that the port market was in utter chaos because monsters were attacking. Essen and Keith are in shock. Without thinking twice, Keith breaks into a run towards the port. Essen tries to call him back. However, Nick also urges him to hurry up and come with them. As they get near to the port market, Essen stops in horror. Right in front of him, as Nick had said, the port market was a mess. Everyone was running and screaming in panic, the buildings trashed and ruined. Essen asks Nick what completely happened. Nick explains that they were auctioning off live monsters, and apparently the monsters all started rampaging. Essen suddenly remembers the cart of monsters that they passed by on their way to the dungeon. His thoughts are stopped at the sound of a large explosion in the middle of the market. Seeing that it was a large pillar of flames, Essen immediately figures out that it must have been Keith. Nick recognizes that it must be towards the port, and he urges Essen to hurry up. They make a break for it as the townspeople run away in the other direction. From what Essen had seen, there were at least 10 leaf crabs on the cart. Knowing that he would try to kill all of them, Essen begs Keith not to do anything reckless. Meanwhile, in a tornado of flame, someone makes soft gasps of pain. Multiple leaf crabs are burnt to a crisp. Keith stands in the middle of the scattered corpses, his arm outstretched and fresh from the attack. His arm is completely burnt again. He flinched from the pain. Looking around him, he counted that he had killed 4 of the crabs. He grimaces in annoyance. Despite having killed so many, he had already used up all his burn medicine from earlier. He had been trying to lure as many as possible on the way to the port. However, he had to assume that there would be more monsters that escaped to other areas too. He's surrounded by more of the leaf crabs. Behind some of the crabs that were coming closer to him, he spots a small child hiding underneath the rubble. Keith knows that at the rate he was going, even his body wouldn't hold out. However, he still activates his gift. Flames encircle his arm as he readies for another attack. He throws the first punch at the closest crab. Casting Volcano Shot, his burnt hand hits the crab. Completely fried, the crab exploded into pieces. Okay, yeah, that's pretty sick. The other crabs are intimidated by his strength. The little girl screams in fear, however Keith stands in front of her. In a protective stance, he declares how strong he is to the monsters. Not sure if they'll understand that, but okay. He swears that he would not let them destroy the town Essen and Nick finally arrive, much to Keith's surprise. Essen worriedly asks about his arm. Keith brushes him off, saying that it was nothing serious and he still had his right arm. Essen asks if he had any medicine left and Keith says no. However, he says that he still had something to do. As his right arm starts to catch flames, he says that Nick went out of his way to call them. So that meant there was probably no one left in town who could fight. He couldn't take all of them out at once, but with a powerful blast of flames, he says that he would defeat every last one of them. The crabs that are not killed are pushed back by the force of the flames. Essen holds his arms up to protect himself from the blast. He immediately grabs onto Keith and tells him to stop or his body wouldn't hold out much longer. Keith angrily tells him to mind his own business. They continue to argue, Essen saying that he would help fight, and Keith could fight while controlling his flames. Keith argues back that he didn't need help from someone so weak, and he orders Essen to get out of town before he gets caught up in the fight. Essen tries to argue back again, but Keith butts Essen's head with his own, annoyed at his persistence. Essen holds onto his forehead, clicking his tongue at Keith's stubbornness. Finally, having enough, Essen summons the forest rabbit's legs skill. Essen prepares himself for the backlash as Keith, Nick, and the little girl stare at him in horror. Keith aims his arm at Essen, accusing him that because of his form, he was a monster disguised as a human. Essen immediately says no, saying that that was the reason why he didn't want to show his gift much, but he explains that it was one of his abilities. He tells Keith that using his gift, he could quickly scout the town. Essen understands that Keith wants to do it alone, but he argues back that he didn't want to abandon Keith either. Essen tells him that he would leave the main fight to Keith until he confirms the town's safety. If he couldn't handle it by then, he would lend a hand. Keith tries to argue back, but he can't say anything else. In a rush to solve their current problems, Essen turns to Nick and asks whether he could escape to where the adults were with the little girl. Nick falters for a second, but Essen reassures him that it would be okay because he was going to become an even more amazing adventurer than them. Nick swallows hard before he takes the girl's hand and makes a run for it. Essen calls out for them to be careful. Before Essen leaves, he begs Keith not to die and that he believes in him, calling him the strongest. Keith tells him to wait, but as Essen gets ready to dash away, he says that being selfish was something they were both guilty of. Before he could say anything else, Keith is surrounded by more crabs. Keith and Essen spring into action. Essen jumps over the town buildings checking for more people. In one of the town alleys, a crab scuttles quickly after a woman running. However, she ends up at a dead end. She collapses by the wall, breathing heavily. The crab behind her slams against a wall. She cries to herself, saying that she brought it upon herself. The crab gets closer and closer, but before it could attack the girl, Essen comes flying from above, slamming his tail into the crab. Essen breaks through its shell and the crab staggers back. He asks the woman if she was all right. The woman is surprised to see him, but she says yes regardless. However, she freezes at something behind him. The crab Essen attacked wasn't dead yet. It raises its pincer to attack. Essen wasn't able to defeat them all yet. The woman screams in horror as Essen is attacked, blood spurting in the middle of the battle. Deep in a forest, a girl holds out her hand to a passing forest wolf from afar. The wolf suddenly stops in its tracks. The girl and her companion move closer to the wolf. The girl looks nervous, but her companion leans closer to the wolf. Gaping in AEW. Seeing the sleeping wolf, the girl's companion comments that her gift was truly something. Her companion says that with the girl's gift, even beginners like them could safely defeat monsters. She grins, saying that it was a big help since her own gift was still weak. Time passes and the girl and her companion have changed. Her companion, now much more experienced, haughtily suggested that maybe they should disband the party. The girl is in shock, unsure what to say. Her companion continues that the girl always just puts monsters to sleep and can't really fight properly. Now that they've reached D rank, her companion says that the girl's abilities were becoming less effective. With a sneer, the companion says that it would be faster to defeat the monsters before putting them to sleep. She added that it irks her that the girl was just reaping the benefits. The girl, now alone, tries to look for new companions. Just as her old companion had said, she could only put monsters to sleep. If it works the same on higher-ranked monsters, it would have been welcomed, but she's unable to use it, and without any combat experience, she's turned away by other adventurers. She frowns as she's left alone once more. Suddenly, two men approach her. One of them says that they've heard that she had quite an interesting gift. The man grins maliciously, asking her if she wanted to team up since they had a profitable plan. Adding that it was a job that only her gift could do, the girl happily agrees. In the present, she stares in horror as blood scatters around her. A piece of cut flesh falls to the ground and she screams. Essen grunts in pain as the crab attacks him. Essen had used his daggered tail as a shield from the crab's attack. The dagger at the tip of his tail was completely severed. The girl behind him screams again, apologizing over and over. Essen breathes a sigh of relief, finding the attack way too close for comfort. The girl asks him in a panic if he was okay. Essen says that although it wasn't quite like a lizard's tail, it wasn't a serious injury, so he was fine. The girl starts to cry once more. Looking at her face properly, Essen realizes that she was one of the adventurers they passed by earlier that morning from the party that let the monsters out. The girl hides her face in shame. She apologizes again, saying that if her gift was only more powerful, then things like this wouldn't have happened. Essen finally understands that the other adventurers had used her gift to incapacitate the monsters. Suddenly, something taps on the floor. The leaf crab, still alive, stands up with its pincers ready. The girl screams again and apologizes, and Essen reprimands her for saying sorry over and over again. What a mood, though. The leaf crab stares at them angrily. Essen stands to protect the girl. He asks her if she could use her ability on the crabs again since his comrades were in danger. Ashamed, the girl admits that she couldn't. Essen is in shock. The girl explains that once they woke up, the monsters seemed to develop a resistance to her powers for a while. Essen yells in disbelief that they were still trying to sell them alive, and the girl apologizes once more. Softly, she says that she knew it was dangerous, but she was just so happy that her gift was needed again. Essen's mouth forms a thin line. He remembers that there were two other men and that they might have invited her because of her gift's effects. He brushes the thoughts away, focusing on needing to deal with his current situation first. He needed to secure their safety quickly and go back to Keith. Suddenly, cracks start to form on a nearby wall before finally exploding as something bursts through the alley. It hits the crab head-on, much to Essen and the girl's surprise. Essen looked up in shock and disbelief at the creature that had just appeared. The tall creature leers down at Essen and the girl, the crab they were once fighting now in its mouth. Biting down fully on the crab and swallowing it whole, Essen exclaims at the creature, which turned out to be a leaf serpent. The leaf serpent was the biggest eater among monsters. Essen couldn't believe that the two men from earlier even brought something like that along with them. He was wondering why he thought the town was too damaged for just a bunch of leaf crabs. The girl, still crying, admits that the two men had said it was delicious when grilled. It was big and would fetch a good price, so she thought she would try and capture it. Essen agrees in a panic that at that size, anyone could feed hundreds of people, but he asks in disbelief how they were planning to cook something that big. The girl apologizes over and over again for being a careless idiot. New game, take a shot for every apology. The conversation is cut off when the leaf serpent finally lunges for them. Essen barely has time to carry the girl and the both of them dodges away at the last second. As the serpent crashes into the wall behind them, Essen makes a break for it with the girl in his arms. The serpent turns back around, glaring at their retreating backs. Essen curses at their bad situation. With the girl in his arms, he couldn't escape to the roof even with his rabbit's leg skills. He had no choice but to hold the serpent off there. The serpent gets ready to attack once more. Essen turns to the girl in a rush, catching her off guard. Making sure that the serpent stays a good distance from them, Essen tells the girl that he would handle the monster and she should escape in the meantime. The girl tells him that the plan wouldn't work, much to Essen's confusion. She explains that her gift was called Hypnotist. It put targeted subjects to sleep, however it had the downside of drawing the hate of the affected targets. Earlier on at the port market, the flame adventurer Keith held all of them off at once so they were able to escape, but she ended up being chased by the monsters that broke free. Now that the girl was separated from the rest of the monsters, their hatred shouldn't be on her anymore. But the leaf serpent was still affected. Essen understands that if they defeat the leaf serpent, they would only have to deal with the monsters Keith was handling. However, the enemy would prioritize targeting the girl over Essen. Forming a plan, Essen lowers the girl to the ground and tells her to keep running. Although the girl is surprised that she was suddenly let go, she does what he says. As she runs, Essen waits for the serpent up on a roof. Running and screaming, the girl begs him not to abandon her. Essen jumps from the roof, promising that he wouldn't do that. As the serpent gets closer to her, he orders her to get down and she crouches, her head in her hands. With a yell, Essen summons the forest cat's sharp claws. He strikes a singular large claw in between the girl and the serpent. The serpent gets closer and closer to the outstretched claw. At the speed it was going, it's unable to stop in time and it went right for the sharp claw in front of it, slicing it into half and barely missing the girl right in front. The serpent's sliced body falls to the ground in two pieces. The girl, covered in blood, slowly gets up in disbelief that they were saved. When she looks up, she finds Essen standing over the sharp claw. Essen breathes a sigh of relief. As he retracts his claw, he's amazed that his plan worked. However, he thinks it's a shame he couldn't get a new skill. He falls to the ground, landing on his feet. He jogs up to the girl, apologizing for using her as bait. The girl brushes his apology away. Essen tells her that he needed to move on quickly. Taking off his cloak that was wrapped around his waist, he tells her that with things getting that big, the Travel God Church would probably step in. However, if possible, he asks that she not tell anyone about his gift. He wraps the cloak over her shoulders. Jogging away, he apologizes and says that he was counting on her. Pulling the cloak closer to herself, the girl quietly watches him leave. Back in the port market, explosions boom all around. A singular leaf crab tries to run away, however Keith quickly finds it. The leaf crab was the last one of the escaped monsters. Keith's whole body was covered in flames, his face to his torso completely burnt. With the whole market roaring within flames, the crab is trapped with Keith in a circle of fire. The crab tries to attack one final time, but Keith holds out a burnt hand. With another rush of explosive flames, he burns the crab into charred pieces. Keith grits his teeth from the pain. The crab's body completely turns into ash. The flames around him slowly start to simmer down. As Essen arrives in the port market, he catches sight of Keith falling to the ground. He calls up to Keith in a panic. He's managed to defeat all the surrounding monsters, but the flames on his body haven't gone out. Essen rushes up to Keith and grabs onto him before throwing the both of them into the seawater. I can't imagine how much the salt would hurt on burns. Essen floats both of them up into the surface as the flames on Keith's body are fully put out. Essen calls out to him over and over again, trying to wake him up, saying that he had defeated all the monsters. Essen swims them back to shore. He pulls them back up and places Keith down on the docks. Breathing heavily from the effort, Essen calls out to Keith once more, but his words are cut short when he hears mumbling. In a muffled voice, Keith says that he was being noisy before ordering him not to yell. With a small smirk, a wounded Keith tells Essen that he was the strongest. Blinking down at him in shock, Essen breathes out a sigh of relief before saying that Keith truly was something. Seeing that Essen came back, Keith asks if the town was safe. Essen confirms, saying that he only got delayed dealing with the leaf crab and the leaf serpent, much to Keith's surprise. He's in disbelief that Essen had defeated such huge monsters. He noticed that Essen didn't have any external injuries. Essen repeats that he was able to, although he wishes that Keith had told him about the monsters. Essen assumes that the wall of flames Keith made wasn't enough to hold the monsters back, but he stays silent. Essen slowly gets back up from the ground, saying that just in case, he was planning to patrol that town once more. Slinging one of Keith's arms over his shoulders, Essen props up Keith's body using his, saying that he needed to take him to a clinic first. Keith and Essen start to argue. Keith tries to argue that he could walk on his own and that being supported by Essen was making his burns hurt more. But Essen argues back that he was lying, that Keith was putting all his weight on him, and if he was the strongest, then he should endure it. Time passes. After running around like that, they received a brief hearing from the guild branch. Thanks to that, Essen fell asleep as soon as he got to the inn. He's completely passed out for the rest of the night. The next morning, as Essen is on his way to the clinic, he passes by a figure that notices him. Turning to him, the person asks if he was indeed Mr. Essen. Essen's confused, but he confirms his identity. The person happily smiles that they were right and introduces themselves as Furcy. They were a priest from the Travel God Church. Asking if Essen had time, Furcy says that they had questions about the events of the other day. Essen nervously looks at Furcy. He hesitates, but he ends up saying yes. Just as he thought, the Travel God Church had really shown up. Percy claps her hands together in glee, thanking him for agreeing even though he must have been tired from the recent events. Furcy happily leads the way, but all Essen could think about was how, for him, the church was worse than any monster. The Travel God Church was an organization of people who served the Travel God. They also manage adventurers who possess gifts. Their role was divided into two main parts. First, to bestow blessings upon those who become followers. People go to the church when they turn 12 and decide to serve the Travel God, or when they convert, they receive the blessing of a gift. Second, they punished followers who violated the doctrine. While general crimes are handled by state organizations, all issues related to church doctrine fall under the jurisdiction of church priests. In other words, if adventures caused monster-related damage to a town, they would become the subject of investigation by the priests. And in this case, it was exactly that. Furcy leads Essen towards the town church. However, what truly concerned Essen was how extremely attached the church was to their doctrine. Absolutely do not tolerate monsters. Gifts existed to defeat monsters. The Travel God Church considers this their most important doctrine. Even though it was only just a part of him, the fact was that Essen could transform his body into a monster. This is pretty weird because even if he did turn into a monster, it's still considered a gift, so how are they going to disregard a god's blessing like that? If the priest were to discover it, he can't say for certain that he wouldn't be purged. Furcy leads the both of them inside. Percy tells Isn't to wait there for a moment at the communal area. Essen is confused, however, he takes a seat at the table. He starts to talk about the incident, however Furcy cuts him off, saying that she's already seen the investigation team's report. Essen turns to the side at the sound of rattling getting closer. He's surprised to see a whole feast right in front of him. Essen is in shock, unsure what to say. Calling him Essen the hero who saved the town, Furcy says that she wanted to meet him so badly that she arrived first thing in the morning that she hadn't even had breakfast yet. Essen sarcastically says that he wasn't given her any. As she takes a bite, Furcy asks if he wanted to eat anything, which Essen turns down. He's at a loss in his predicament, but then he pauses. With a huff, he tells Furcy that the hero wasn't him, but it was Keith, and that he just helped a little. Furcy says that he was just being modest, but Essen argues that it was the truth and he wanted to visit Keith after their talk. As such, he asks Furcy to keep it brief. Furcy tells him that she understood. Since it was an irregular monster subjugation, she tells him that there might have been some gaps, but she's already added quite a bonus to both of their contribution scores. Essen is ecstatic at the news, saying that it was a big help. Furcy smiles at him warmly. Getting straight to business, Furcy wonders out loud what to ask first. Essen is unnerved, saying that things were just as written in the report. Furcy agrees but says that it was important to hear it directly. Essen tries to explain that he didn't see the moment the monsters went berserk and that he just found out on his way back from the dungeon. Furcy understands that he wasn't even in town when the incident occurred, however, with sharp eyes, she says that she heard that he knew the culprit's face. Thinking about it, Essen says that he knew one of them, but he only passed them by in front of the dungeon, and that he didn't know their name or anything else. Essen tries to ask if the culprits have been found, but Furcy says that it was a secret. However, she informs him that the girl with the hypnotist gift was being held in a separate room inside the building. Essen is surprised at the information. Percy says that it was rare for someone to turn themselves in. Hesitantly, Essen asks what would happen to her. With a serious expression, Percy holds her knife up to her neck and says that it was, of course, the death penalty. Essen freezes in horror. Suddenly, the tension is gone from Percy as she says that it would only be after they took her gift away. Essen stays quiet. The terrifying thing about the church was that everything was at the discretion of the priests. If they had a reason, they could take away gifts and even easily decide on the death penalty. Percy says that they all deserve the death penalty, but the girl was the most guilty of them. Hypnotizing monsters and letting them out was bad enough, but losing control and plunging the town into chaos and danger was even worse. Essen thought that he reported it already, but he explains that due to the drawback of her gift, she attracted monsters, so she fled in the opposite direction of the evacuating townspeople. Trying to defend her, Essen says that she may have made a mistake, but it was a fact that the girl helped to minimize the damage. Percy pauses for a moment. Suddenly, her face twists up into a sneer. She asks him if Essen thought that someone's evaluation should go up if they defeated the monsters they brought themselves. Rather harsh, but she definitely has a point. Realizing what she was trying to say, Essen clenches his fist and nervously stays quiet. He grits his teeth and doesn't say anything else for the rest of Percy's meal. Finally, after time passes, Percy announces that she got the gist of it. Essen hesitantly stands up, saying that if it was helpful, then that's what matters. Percy says that it was a good thing that Essen and Keith were in the town. Bowing low to him, Percy thanks him over and over on behalf of the Travel God Church. Essen awkwardly acknowledges her gratitude before announcing that he was leaving. Suddenly, Percy raises her head and asks one more thing. Essen starts to walk away, but Percy explains that during the commotion, there were reports of people seeing a human-shaped monster or a human who looked like a monster. She asks him if he knew anything about that. Essen hesitates, gritting his teeth. When he turns back around to face Percy, he smiles and says he didn't know anything. He tries to say that since everyone was pretty confused, it wouldn't have been strange if there were some misunderstandings. Percy says that she understood that even Essen, who patrolled the town, didn't know anything. However, with a dark look in her eyes, she tells him that if there were any monsters pretending to be human, the church would have to execute them. Essen struggles to keep up his smile. Essen starts to nervously sweat, his smile becoming wobbly the longer he tries to remain composed. Clapping her hands together, Percy apologizes for keeping him. Finally, Essen leaves the church as Percy thanks him again and hopes that they could meet again somewhere. As Essen slowly walks away, his face is horrified and he's drenched in sweat. Essen roughly lets out a gasp in relief once he's far away enough. Exhausted from the stress, he thinks that he would rather not meet Percy again. He eventually gets back to town and finds the clinic. The moment he enters the clinic, Essen is greeted with the image of Keith lying in bed and completely covered in bandages, his eyes and hair the only things seen through the cloth. Beside him, Nick happily greets Essen. The little girl they saved from before was also there with Nick. Essen is glad that she was safe. He walks closer, asking them how Keith was doing. Nick explains that the doctor said his injuries have healed, however he needed to rest until the regenerating skin settles. Although not adventurers, doctors also received gifts from the healing god of compassion and life to treat people. Essen smiles, relieved to know the news. Suddenly, he hears mumbling. He turns to find Keith trying to speak through the bandages, his expression angry. Essen tells him that he couldn't understand what he was saying, although he could tell he was energetic. Pulling down the bandages over his mouth, Keith tells the kids not to look at him in such a pathetic state, or they would be traumatized. Suddenly, Nick explodes in a loud voice, telling Keith that he was still super cool, much to his surprise. Excitedly, he says that even if it was the other day or today, he still looked cool. Nick turns to the girl, asking for her thoughts, and she happily agrees. She turns to Keith and asks if she would be able to become an adventurer like him. Keith pauses for a moment before turning away with a blush, saying that they were a strange bunch. Nick and the girl smile at him one more time before they bid them farewell, since they had to help out at the shop. Essen watches them go with a smile before turning to Keith and saying that they would surely become great adventurers. Keith's confused by his words. Essen explains that since they've seen that back of his protecting them, they definitely could be great adventurers. Blushing at the praise, Keith agrees with Essen's words. Essen laughs lightly. Suddenly, Keith is quiet. He clenches his fist. He calls out to Essen, saying that he had one request. Essen happily waits for his words until he realizes that Keith had referred to him with his correct name. In the E-rank dungeon Roaring Reef, Essen turns to Keith and asks to make sure if he was in top condition. Keith says that of course he was and asks Essen who he thinks he was talking to. Something large starts to make its way up from the water. Keith warns Essen that he was the one who needed to be careful, but with a grin, Essen tells him to leave it to him. In front of them, a large one-eyed monster bursts from the sea, shrieking loudly. Essen and Keith prepare for battle, focusing on the monster looming before them. They had found themselves there after their conversation back in the clinic. Keith asks Essen to fulfill his request. Essen asks if he really meant to ask from him, which Keith reluctantly confirms. Essen lightly teases Keith for asking help from the eternal last place he's been mocking all this time, successfully annoying Keith. Essen tells Keith that he was just kidding before asking what the request was. Keith pauses before hesitantly thanking Essen for agreeing. For the request, Keith asks Essen for help in defeating a monster. The target was a leaf shrimp. Essen remembers that it was a giant shrimp monster said to be the strongest in the roaring reef. Wonder why the deep-sea creature was named leaf shrimp. Keith suddenly tries to sit up and Essen goes to help him as he struggles. But Keith pushes his hand away. His fist shaking, he admits that he was weak. Whoa, bro is going through his character development arc. Keith says that of course his gift was the strongest, but he couldn't handle its overwhelming power himself. Moreover, the roaring reef dungeon was surrounded by water, which was the worst match for him. Even if he tried to conquer it alone, the best he could hope for is mutual destruction. That is definitely not the best solution. He admits that he's given up challenging it for years now. Essen laughs, saying that he couldn't believe that those were the words coming from someone who did something reckless the other day. Keith pauses before he frowns. He admits that it was because it reminded him of his hometown. Essen stays quiet at the serious tone of his voice. Keith continues that it wasn't like someone released monsters or anything, instead it was a monster overflow. Small recap, monster overflow is what happens when the endlessly spawning monsters exceed the containment capacity, making the barrier break and resulting in a disaster that strikes people. Keith's village was destroyed because of that. Essen apologizes for asking, but Keith brushes him off, saying that it was fine. It was true that the village was destroyed, but no one died during the calamity. In Keith's mind, he still remembers his past where a tall hero stands before him wielding a broken great sword. Essen smiles at the story. Keith says that it was thanks to a single adventure. He's heard that the hero is retired now due to the severe injuries he received during that battle. Keith figured that if he had waited for reinforcements, he could have continued being an adventurer. But he chose to save the lives in front of him and protected everyone alone. A younger Keith stares in awe at the hero. Keith smiles at the memory, saying that that was what he considered to be the strongest. Essen smiles along with him. Keith says that that was why he wanted to become stronger. Raising his right arm, still heavily bandaged, that was the reason he absolutely needed the reward for defeating the leaf shrimp. Essen asks what the reward for defeating the leaf shrimp was. Keith says that if an adventurer defeated the leaf shrimp, they would receive the water spirit's blessing as a reward from the guild. The water spirit's blessing was a blessing that reduces burn damage. Essen says that that was the perfect blessing for him. Keith grins at his excitement. Immediately, Essen takes the chance to tease him about his expression, making Keith embarrassed. You know a true friend would take the opportunity to make fun of you. Changing the subject, Essen asks why he was asking him for help. Keith admits that he senses the same conviction in him that he had, and that was all there was to it. Soon, their battle in the roaring reef begins. The leaf shrimp barrels through the water, aiming for Essen. But Essen dodges in time, making the shrimp crash into a pile of rocks. Essen ducks as the debris from the rocks explode all over. Essen ran, glancing behind him at the leaf shrimp pursuing him. The shrimp was huge, but it was still fast. He adds that he and Keith were at a disadvantage with their footing on shallow water. From behind him, Keith yells for him not to dawdle, making sure to call him the eternal last placer, of course. Keith warns Essen that if he messes up, they have no chance of winning. Essen stops running right in front of the chirping shrimp, saying that he was glad to see Keith in good spirits. Suddenly, the shrimp raises its tail. It summons great waves all around them, but Keith and Essen hide behind large rocks for protection in time. Essen peeks behind him when the waves settle. His role was to be the decoy. Leaping out of his hiding place with his rabbit legs, he summons his large claws. He swipes at the shrimp in a frenzy, trying to cut at its shell. The shrimp cries out at the cuts on its shell. It was frustrating, but Essen couldn't match Keith's instantaneous firepower. As Essen had expected, its shell was even harder than the leaf crab's. It was taking time for Keith to unleash his maximum power. Keith was currently hiding behind the larger rocks, gathering his strength. Essen had to use his speed to whittle down the monster's stamina, and when it got tired, Keith could finally finish it off with one blow. The shrimp charges for Essen again, but he hops along the rocks to avoid it. Essen taunts it by saying that the shrimp had quick bursts of speed, but it could only move in straight lines, so it wasn't hard to dodge. The shrimp seems to understand him, getting pissed at his words. As Essen continues to hop along the rocks, he thinks that the shrimp with its big size should probably be consuming a lot of energy, so it was only up to Keith now. However, the shrimp suddenly raises a claw. Something fast moves towards Essen. Before he could react, Essen is blasted by a large explosion, hitting him square in the back. Keith calls out to Essen in a panic as he goes down on the water. Looking rather smug, the shrimp had blasted him with a blast from its cannon. Keith tries to look for Essen from his place behind the rocks as he continues to try and power up his arm. The attack that Essen just got hit with was the leaf shrimp's ultimate weapon, the air cannon. Suddenly, the leaf shrimp looks to Keith's direction and spots him. The shrimp fires another air cannon at Keith. Keith throws his cloak back, forced to use his gift. He summons a wall of flame at the air cannon, meeting it halfway. The leaf shrimp was surprised by his attack. With steam covering them, Keith goes to pick up Essen. He worriedly asks Essen if he was alright. Bro got hit with an air cannon at point-blank range. I doubt he's doing completely fine. Essen remains knocked out for a second before he snaps back awake. He apologizes for letting his guard down. Keith warns him to not underestimate the enemy just because he was in the party with him. Keith lowers Essen back into the waters and they resume running. Keith asks Essen if he could move and tells him that they should regroup for the moment. Keith tells Essen that he used up his flame charge to save him, asking what he thought they should do now. Essen asks Keith if he could recharge right at that moment. However, the shrimp raises its claw again. Keith notices immediately and meets its blast with his flames once more. Steam covers them. Keith says that it was difficult to recharge right then because it seemed like the shrimp was targeting him now. They wait for the steam to clear. When they see the shrimp again, its two claws were raised. Oh, that can't be good. Staring them down, the shrimp powers up its air cannons. Keith and Essen start to sweat nervously as they realize that since the shrimp had two claws, and there were two of them, then it could target the both of them at the same time. They make a break for it as multiple air cannon shots are thrown their way. One of the air cannon shots hits Essen's arm and he swears. Turning around to face the air cannons, Essen uses his gift to try and deflect one of them. Keith says that they couldn't regroup at their current situation as he struggles to hold back some of the shots. Seeing him struggle, Keith turns around as well and warns Essen. He summons his gift again, flames enveloping his arms. He aims his shot at the water, a burst of steam enveloping them all. The shrimp stops pursuing them, chirping in discontent as the steam makes Essen and Keith disappear. The shrimp squints, trying to find them. Meanwhile, Keith and Essen remain hidden. Essen comments that the attacks have stopped. He's surprised that Keith's gift could also be able to do that, bro. It's just water and fire, it's not rocket science. Keith says that it was just a distraction that will clear up soon. He says that at the rate they were going, they were at a disadvantage. He adds that there was no point in hiding the way they were each time. When they eventually run out of burn medicine, it was over for them. If that happened, they would have no choice but to try again another day. Essen says that he'd like to avoid rocking up more lodging expenses. Observing Essen for a moment as he controlled his gift, Keith then asks if his gift could transform him into any monster. Essen tells him that he could just gain skills from parts of the monsters he's eaten. Keith says that his gift of devouring and stealing made him question if one of these days Essen would really turn into a monster. Which is quite the valid observation, I'm not gonna lie. Essen looks horrified and asks him not to say scary things like that. With a small smile, Keith tells him not to worry because if that happened, he would make sure to take care of him properly. You know a bro a real one if they promise to take you down when you eventually lose control of your monster abilities. Essen thanks him for the reassurance, although hesitantly. Keith supposed that Essen didn't have any monster skills that would be effective against the shrimp at the moment. He suggests eating the shrimp to gain its skills. Essen points out that it would be difficult to get close to the thing. Keith pushes that this time he would be the one to lure it in, and that its antennae should be defenseless. Essen tries to argue that the antennas might get stuck in his throat, but Keith looms over him asking who would be responsible for their plan falling apart. Rather afraid, Essen hesitantly agrees. Essen says that there was no guarantee that he would gain a skill that could turn the situation around. Keith says that he was aware, but it was still better if they had more weapons to use. Summoning their abilities once more, they get ready to go back into the fight. The shrimp watches the steam continue to take most of the field. Suddenly, sensing danger, it moves its head to the side as a ball of fire is thrown its way. It looks behind to find Keith. Keith clicks his tongue as the steam around him disperses. Annoyed that his attack missed, he raises his arm into the air, summoning more fire. His situation was something he didn't want, but this time he would be the decoy. He shoots another wall of flame at the shrimp from a distance. But the shrimp stayed standing after the attack. As Keith had expected, his power decreases at long range. The shrimp shrieks as it gets ready to attack once more. Keith prepares himself. Their hits collide in the middle, leaving a devastating explosion. The shrimp's air cannon starts to merge with the flames before fading away. Keith is forced back. Their attacks were starting to cancel out, but not quite as well. They were starting to synergize. Unbeknownst to the shrimp, a figure was steadily getting closer from above. Essen falls from the sky, and as he passes the shrimp's head, he bites down on one of its antennae. Both the shrimp and Keith are surprised. Keith looks more disgusted than anything, really. And Essen lands in front of them. He bites down on the antennae and swallows. A voice in his head rings out telling him that he's acquired the leaf shrimp's air cannon. Turning around to face the shrimp, he says that he'll put its power to good use right away. His arm is enveloped by his gift as it shifts to the leaf shrimp's claw. He aims it at the shrimp. He releases a blast from his cannon as the shrimp raises his own. His claw is knocked back and Essen exclaims at the strong recoil. The steam disappears and the shrimp remains standing only slightly damaged. Essen exclaims that the cannon still wasn't enough to defeat it, but Keith argues back that it was good enough. Keith explains that its ability was air cannon. It was a skill that releases super compressed air from the muscles and the pincers. Keith wonders what would happen if they released his flames and fired with the air cannon simultaneously. However, their conversation is cut short as they're bombarded with air cannons once more. Keith clicks his tongue as he summons his flames. There was no time to explain. He orders Essen to fire his air cannon at maximum capacity. Essen asks if that would be enough to defeat it, but Keith admits that he wasn't sure. Essen pauses for a moment. Eventually he agrees, saying that he would trust Keith. The shrimp's air cannons continue to bombard them. Holding out his hands, Keith summons Prominence Blast once more. At the same time, Essen fires his air cannon. Their firepower merges into a large ball of energy heading for the shrimp at full blast. The shrimp shrieks as it's overtaken by a tornado of flames. Essen and Keith watch as the shrimp disintegrates. Keith and Essen stare at the charred remains of the leaf shrimp. Half of its body was burnt to a crisp. The lower half, the only thing left. Damn, they nuked him. Keith and Essen pump their fists in the air, celebrating their victory. Essen gives him a thumbs up, saying that it was thanks to Keith's quick thinking that they won. Keith huffs out proudly, saying that it was only natural because he was the strongest. They get closer to the shrimp's body. Essen asks if they'll be able to get the water spirit's blessing now. Keith says that that was the deal in exchange for the shrimp's legs. He grabs onto one of them and pulls it free. Keith says that they were a bit charred, but that much should be fine. One arm wrapped around the leg, he pumps his hand up into the air, saying that he could now reach even greater heights. The bright sun beams down on them. Walking back to the city, Keith asks Essen what he was going to do now. Essen says that he was going back home for now, especially since he was out of lodging money. He throws the same question back at Keith. Keith says that he plans to stay a bit longer, especially when he promised to train some disciples too. Nick comes to mind immediately. Essen says that it was goodbye then and that he hopes that they were both advanced adventures the next time they meet. Keith grins, saying that that was the plan. He says that Essen was a big help and he wants to thank him. With a smile, Keith thanks him full-heartedly. Keith raises a fist up to him. Essen replies with his own grin, bumping their fists together. Later on, in the Advanced Adventurers Guild, a man stands by the entrance. He waits for a familiar figure to exit the building. As Polaris passes by the entrance, the man calls out to her. Polaris's gaze turns icy. The man grins, complimenting that she looked as beautiful as always. Polaris sighs in exasperation, asking if he was lying in wait for her again. She comments that he must have a lot of free time. A lot of time annoying people, is what I think. The man was Advanced Adventurer rank 73, Wellness. Wellness winks at her, saying that it was just a coincidence. With a frown, Polaris says that coincidence or not, she had told him to stop following her around. She wasn't going to join their party. Polaris says that he would just be a burden to her. Wellness laughs, saying that she was as harsh as ever. Polaris tries to walk away, but Wellness follows her. He says that his gift wasn't specialized for combat, so it would probably not suit her personality, but their ability should be a perfect match. Makes me wonder what it is if this guy is so confident in it. Polaris tries to pointedly ignore him. Suddenly, Wellness says that that wasn't why he came to talk with her that day. Turning to him, annoyed, Polaris asks what he wanted. With a sneer, he tells her that he was surprised the other day. One moment, Polaris was looking at the ranking board, then suddenly she ran off. And of all the places, she went to the lower district. Polaris glares at him, asking if he followed her. Wellness laughs, saying that it wasn't right for someone as noble as her to go to such a filthy place. Polaris says that that was none of his business, and he should stop saying such nonsense and get out of her way. With a dark look in his eyes, Wellness asks if that was what she really thought so. Looking thoughtfully, Wellness pretends to struggle remembering Essen's name. Oh, he's playing that card now. Polaris freezes. Wellness smirks, saying that he's never seen Polaris make that kind of face before. She glares at him. Sliding up beside her, Wellness tells her not to worry since he wasn't planning to do anything to Essen right now. However, he says that for noble people like her and him, a certain level of dignity was expected. He takes her chin in his hands. This guy is sleazy in every sense of the word, I see, and says that getting too friendly with trash-like lower-ranking adventurers might affect the reputation of all advanced adventures. Wellness drags a thumb over Polaris's lips. Ew, saying that depending on her future actions, something might happen to Essen. However, he laughs and suddenly lets go of her. With a sneer, he says to leave such vulgar talk at that. Polaris stumbles forward as Wellness leaves. Waving a hand in goodbye, he tells her to think carefully about it, adding that he would always welcome her. Left behind, Polaris glares icily as he walks away. back at the lower rank Adventurers Guild. On the adventure rank board, Essen's name was now on rank 65,000. He curls his fists, pumped up with his new accomplishment. Last time he checked, he was around 85,000. The expedition really boosted his ranking. However, he laughs awkwardly. It was hard to be happy about it considering the overflow incident. A figure behind him notices his presence. The girl at the front desk grins at the sight of him. Calling out to him, Essen waves at Aruru. He walks closer and says that it's been a while. Aruru welcomes him back. She raises a stack of papers and says that she was able to read the Travel God Church's report. She comments that it must have been tough for him. Rubbing the back of his neck, Essen says that it was manageable and he just happened to be there, adding that he didn't really do much. Aruru points to a photo on the paper saying that what Essen said wasn't true. His report on defeating a big monster was in there. Essen comments that Aruru really read the paper thoroughly. Aruru says that it was her job, especially when Essen was the one who gets involved. Essen awkwardly said that he was grateful and that he didn't think he'd get so much attention. Realizing her words, Aruru's face bursts into red. She frantically waves her hands around, stuttering that she wasn't specifically following Essen around or anything. Excited, Essen says that he understood. He was still a lower-ranking adventurer, so Aruru was just looking out for him. The level of support for one of thousands of adventurers made him appreciate how first-class she was. Aruru puffs out her cheeks at the misunderstanding. Yeah, I'd be pissed too, not gonna lie. Trying to save face, she says that he was right and that a lower-ranked guild staff member like her didn't have the luxury to cheer for specific people. Essen nervously asks if she was angry or something as Aruru hides her face behind the stack of papers. Behind it, her face is indeed angry, but she denies it. She's so real for that, OMG. There's a pause between them both as Essen stays confused and Aruru continues to hide behind the papers. Finally, she says that she was glad he was safe. Essen smiles at her. Eventually, she stops hiding her face and she smiles up at him, telling him to keep up the good work and stay focused from then on. In addition to the incident, there were rumors about strange tools circulating in the lower district lately. Essen says that the area really does have poor public safety, so Aruru should be careful too. Aruru thanks him for his concern. Changing the subject, she rustles around below the counter. She takes out a large notebook from beneath. It was a notebook of recommended dungeon summaries. Aruru says that she thought it might suit his current skill level and she's gathered some dungeons she'd like to recommend right away. It was something she made herself. Oh, girly did her homework, that's awesome. Essen excitedly thanks her. She flips through the pages of the notebook. This time she recommended the Phoenix Fern Valley. It was a place with extreme terrain carved by multiple rivers. It was considered the most difficult among E-rank dungeons. Arriving in the dungeon, Essen looks up at the towering spires reaching above. He squints through the sunlight, seeing a bird-like monster flying high above. He mutters to himself. It really was the most difficult dungeon, seeing that the terrain would certainly limit adventurers that could clear it. But the terrain mixed with Essen's current gifts gave him an edge. He summons his rabbit legs and his air cannon claws. He quickly hops over the spires. When he reaches high enough, he's within distance of the bird-like monster. Essen positions himself for an attack and the bird notices his presence. It can only let out a squeak as it's shot with Essen's air cannon. Immobilized, Essen jumps over the bird. While still in midair, he takes a bite out of it. A voice echoes in his ears saying that he acquired the Valley Hawk's sharp eyes. Essen and the hawk start falling to the ground. But before Essen could hit the earth, he summons the frog's tongue and grabs hold of a tree branch jutting out from one of the spires. He lands painlessly on the ground as the hawk comes crashing. He thanks it for the meal, retracting his tongue. Essen comments that his new gift sharp eyes was an unfamiliar term. He decides to try it out and see what it could do. He activates it and immediately his pupils dilate. Suddenly, everything seems to pass by him in an instant. He exclaims that everything was amazing. He felt like his vision had expanded, and his dynamic visual acuity was incredible. He could even see the smallest mouse scurrying on the floor. Suddenly, he looks up to find another bird-like monster soaring in the skies. In the bird-like monster's claws was a human squealing that they were going to be eaten. Breathing heavily and a blush dusting her cheeks, the girl repeats that she was going to be deliciously eaten. That's definitely one way to describe being eaten, Essen exclaims at the sight of her, thinking she was going to be attacked. Using his new gift, Essen is able to see the girl squeal as she gets lifted up by the bird-like monster. Essen starts to panic as he realizes it was a valley falcon carrying the girl. He needed to help quickly. However, just as he moves, a sudden wave of dizziness hits him. He grabs onto his head, confused at the weird feeling. He breathes heavily, trying to focus his eyes. He realizes he still wasn't used to them. He orders them to deactivate. Once he does so, he realizes how far away the girl and the bird actually were. Meanwhile, the girl in the bird's claws squeals again, excited that she was flying. With a blush on her cheeks, she wonders if the bird wouldn't eat her right away, And if that meant it would take her back to its nest, bro, I don't think she needs saving. Suddenly, she notices movement from one of the spires. A few feet away from her, Essen lands on one of the branches jutting out from the spire. Frowning in focus, Essen yells that he would save her. Bro, I honestly think she's where she wants to be right now. He leaps up from the spire using his rabbit legs. The girl has sparkles in her eyes at the sight of him. Seeing him talk, she wondered if he was a human-like monster. Essen had used his sharp eyes to make sure it was safe even if they fell by confirming that there was a big river below them. The only thing left was to put his plan into action. He throws his head back. Whipping his head forward, he summons his frog tongue, hoping to grab the falcon's wing skill. His tongue wraps itself around the claws holding onto the girl. Essen's hand sharpens and grows longer in front of the falcon. With a swipe of his sharp claws, Essen cuts through its legs. He cuts off the claws holding onto the girl, pulling her to him using his frog tongue. The claws start to loosen their hold on her. Eventually, they fully let go of the girl and she starts to free fall. She yells in alarm as she goes down. Essen followed soon after, diving down with her. He pulls up the falcon's claws up to his mouth and bites down. He waits for the voice that tells him that he acquired the Valley Falcon's silver wings. His eyes lighten as he hears it. He presses his arms close to his sides to fall faster. When he's close enough to the girl, he yells for her to reach out her hand. Taking notice of him, she struggles to give her hand to him. The moment he takes it, feathers burst out. Essen holds the girl safely in his arms as he lowers the two of them slowly using his new wings. Essen's rabbit feet stop just inches away from the river's waterbed. The girl says that they just stopped in time, but Essen cuts her off, saying that they didn't. They go crashing into the water in the next second. Time passes as they dry themselves off. Essen apologizes for letting both of them fall into the river. It was his first time using the wings, so he couldn't control it. As the girl wrings her jacket dry, she reassures him that it was okay and he was only trying to save her. Thankful for her understanding, he asks if she was hurt. However, she suddenly holds onto his hand, saying that there was something more important. Oh boy, this can't be good. In a rush, she leans in closer to him and asks him questions one after another. What was the form he took earlier, if he really was human? If it was some kind of gift? If he could do it again? How he even had all sorts of parts that looked just like a monster's? Essen blinks at her at a loss for words. Finally, the girl leans back and apologizes. She got too excited and couldn't help herself. She introduces herself as Ryuka. Essen introduces himself as well, and she excitedly thanks him. Essen stays quiet for a moment as he watches her. Eventually, the girl asks what was wrong. Hesitantly, Essen asks if she wasn't scared of him. Essen explains that her reaction was different from others. Even though he saved her, normally people would be suspicious of someone who looked like a monster. The girl tilts her head in thought. She explains that the types of monsters that appear are already determined for each dungeon and the barrier's power prevents monsters from moving to other dungeons from outside. So it only made sense that it wasn't a monster but an adventurer's gift or ability. Essen hesitantly agrees but points out that there was also the possibility of a newly appeared monster. With a blush and excited look on her face, Ryuka starts to drool and breathe heavily as she tells him that she loves monsters. Oh, she's that type of person, Ulmao. She says that even if Essen really was a monster, she honestly wouldn't care. If anything, she'd want to get closer to a human-shaped monster. Essen looks scared as he backs away. Honestly, same. Ryuka continues that she thought monsters were cool. They all had specialized organs developed for hunting, and their designs were just irresistible. Essen is dumbstruck when Ryuka admits that earlier she tried to get caught by the falcon just to see one up close. Although she hadn't thought about what would happen after getting caught, girl was willing to risk it all just for that one moment. Kinda respect it. With that in mind, she starts to go around Essen before excitedly asking him to show her his wings and fangs again. She claps her hands together in request. Essen hesitantly says that with a gift like that, he didn't really want to show it to people. Ryuka slides up next to him and teases him for suddenly being shy, especially since he's already shown it to her once, so it should be fine. She pokes at his cheeks, making him embarrassed. He eventually agrees, seeing that he had no choice. Essen calls out the Valley Falcon's silver wings once more. Ryuka's face lights up immediately and her eyes start to glitter. Essen asks if that was good enough. But before he can deactivate them, Ryuka throws herself at the back of his wings. Oh, you're screwed, bro. She was completely amazed that they were just like real wings. Ryuka wraps her arms around Essen, making him squeal in surprise. She's locked in now and so are you, Essen. Lost in her excitement, Ryuka lists down her observations about Essen's wings, excited to find them fluffier, softer, and relatively darker than their original counterpart. Essen completely freezes, his face going red as Ryuka comments that it was a shame that his wings didn't smell like an animal. Shaking, he manages to stutter out for her to stop. He eventually has enough and flies away from her, making her stumble forward. Essen drops to the ground after deactivating the wings on his back. Blushing furiously, he says that he had enough and if Ryuka licked them, it would feel weird. Hold up, she was planning on licking them? Ryuka marvels at the fact that he can actually feel with them. Girl, that is definitely not our current concern. She continues to try and push him to let her, saying that it wasn't like they would disappear. But internally, Essen couldn't help but feel nervous feeling her chest pressed up against him. He grumbles to himself at his pathetic behavior. Ryuka coyly says that if Essen really didn't like it, she guessed she had no choice. Essen hides his embarrassed face by turning his back to her, exposing his clothes that were ripped open by his wings. Ryuka stares at him thoughtfully. She hesitantly asks him if he was a lower-ranking adventurer. Essen confirms it before asking why the sudden question. Ryuka points out that his clothes were still torn. She explains that mid-rank adventurers and above often have equipment made from monster materials, and many of them have regenerative properties. Essen touches the hole on the back of his clothes with an awkward smile. He comments that she knew a lot before asking if she was a high-ranking adventurer or something similar. Ryuka laughs, saying that she was just a humble craftsman by trade, which was why she suddenly thought she'd make some equipment for him. Later in the day, she leads the two of them to a rather large building with an odd shape. As they arrive, she grins at Essen and tells him to think of it as thanks for saving her and showing her his gift. She throws her hands up in greeting as she welcomes him to her workshop. Essen marvels at the building. He had no idea there was a workshop like that outside the city. Now that he thought about it, it was his first time visiting a craftsman's workshop. Essen asks why the building had legs like a giant spider. She has to keep up with her aesthetic, of course, let a girl have her hobbies and all that. Ryuka laughs, saying that it certainly looked more like a monster than a workshop. She explains that the building was something she had created with her gift. Her gift was called the Magic Workshop. Essen commented that craftsmen's gifts were amazing, but Ryuka disagreed with him. Normal craftsmen had gifts related to their skills like blacksmith or chef, but hers seemed a bit different from the others. She winks at him like they were sharing a secret and tells him that it was like his gift. Essen smiles, asking if she meant it was a special kind of gift. He laughs and says that he liked it when it was put like that, and Ryuka agrees. She opens the door for the both of them. Ryuka urges him to come inside, and Essen is introduced to a large work area. He marvels at the workbench, the tools, materials scattered all over, and the burning fireplace. He follows Ryuka deeper into the building. Looking at everything inside the workshop, Essen comments that she really did seem like a craftsman. Ryuka agrees before saying that she would just need to prepare a couple of things, so he was free to look around. Essen agrees, his eyes immediately wandering to see a monster's skeletal jaw on the table. He wonders if the jaws were from mid-rank materials or higher. He touches the skeleton as Ryuka speaks again. Suddenly, the monster's jaws bite down on Essen's finger. Essen screams in surprise and pain, trying to wave the skeleton away, but it was clamped down shut on his finger. Ryuka makes a half-hearted comment for him not to touch things so carelessly. Essen panics, saying that his finger was about to be cut off, but Ryuka just laughs at him. Eventually, Essen's finger is tightly bandaged up. Ryuka tells him that undead materials were just like that. Essen complains that she could have told him that earlier, but Ryuka argues that Essen was the one who tried to touch it without permission. Essen continues to cry from the pain, saying that although it was true that she only said that he could look, it was clearly still a trap. Ryuka happily claps her hands together, saying that that was a good idea for new equipment. She writes the idea down before closing her notebook and changing the subject. She stores the notebook away and rustles through her pockets for an item. Saying that it might eventually get too late to do it, she takes out a roll of measuring tape. With a bright smile, she tells him that she needed to take his measurements to make his equipment, so she orders him to take his clothes off. Oh, this can't be good either. Essen pauses at her words. Before he can say anything, Ryuka rips his jacket and shirt off, saying that if he didn't hurry it would get dark soon. Essen screams in horror, but Ryuka pushes on, reminding him not to forget his normal and monster states. Essen yells for her not to just start undressing him. Ryuka asks if he was embarrassed, and Essen tries to defend himself, saying that he just needed time to mentally prepare. Ryuka brushes his words away, saying that it was fine because she was used to seeing naked men. From outside the workshop, quiet footsteps near the door. Don't tell me things are about to get worse. A fist is raised to knock, but the person stops, confused by the noise coming from inside. Just as Ryuka and Essen continue to argue, holding off one another, the person from outside calls out to Ryuka. The door swings open and Essen turns around at the sound of a familiar voice, asking for some sword maintenance. Essen sweats nervously in horror while Ryuka freezes, a smile stuck on her face at her new guest. Polaris stares at Essen in disbelief and disgust. Oh god, it really did get worse. Meanwhile, Essen seems to look more horrified as he confirms who was at the door. Ryuka, on the other hand, welcomes Polaris in. Essen and Polaris ask each other at the same time why the other was there. In the main workplace area, Essen is left alone with Polaris. She stares him down as Essen sits stiffly on a chair. His eyes make their way up to her and their gazes meet. Well, this is horrible awkward. Essen hesitantly starts a conversation, commenting that it's been a while since they last saw each other. Polaris replies in a clipped voice, agreeing with him and turning away with a frown. Essen tries to keep going, saying that he was surprised to run into her in a place like that. Again, Polaris icily agrees with him. Suddenly, a chill starts to overtake Essen as the room seems to get colder. After a moment of silence, Polaris asks if she was interrupting something. Essen is confused. With a dark expression on her face, Polaris says that there was no need for him to play dumb. Looking at Essen's half-naked body, Polaris says that she was able to tell by his appearance alone that it looked like he was having quite the fun time. Bro, despite how she uses ice powers, I feel like she's about to cook you alive. Essen immediately tries to cover himself up, yelling that Ryuka just made him take his clothes off and he only met her today. His words only make Polaris frown more. Horrible, horrible way to explain things, bro. The chill around them gets worse as Polaris glares at him, asking if he was the type of person to do things at the house of a woman he just met. Essen looks horrified once more as he realizes that he had phrased things wrong. As the cold of Polaris's gift continues to surround the room, he tries to defend himself best he can. He says that it was only a misunderstanding. Polaris comments that he seemed pretty relaxed with his adventuring work, but Essen immediately disagrees. In a frenzy, Essen says that it was only necessary for taking his measurements. It was definitely not an inappropriate relationship, and he didn't have the time for fooling around with women. Finally, Polaris breathes out a soft sigh, a smile on her lips. Her expression warmer, she laughs and tells him that she was only joking. Seeing Essen's face after so long, and especially looking very embarrassed, she just felt like teasing him a bit. Essen deflates, complaining that it was definitely a terrifying way to tease him, saying that he even felt like he was freezing. I'm pretty sure she really was trying to freeze your skin off, though. Polaris apologizes. She explains that she's known Ryuka even longer than Essen has, so she knew what kind of person she was. Essen asks if Ryuka was the one who made the equipment Polaris uses. Polaris confirms it. She explains that among advanced adventurers, Ryuka was known as a top-class advanced craftsman. Surprised at the knowledge, Essen stands up and exclaims in disbelief. Polaris says that that was the reason she was more surprised to see him there. At that moment, Ryuka re-enters the room. She apologizes for making Polaris wait. Holding Polaris's rapier in her hands, she informs her that she was done with sword maintenance. Polaris thanks her as she takes her weapon back. Ryuka watches as she tests out the weight and feel of the rapier. She tells Polaris that there wasn't much to fix, but she did make the magic output a bit easier to channel. Polaris compliments her, telling Ryuka she was always such a big help. Ryuka compliments her back that Polaris really took such great care of her things. Polaris wills her sword away before saying that the items Ryuka made were just really high quality. The praise makes Ryuka bashful. Essen smiles as he listens to their conversation. Ryuka was an advanced craftsman acknowledged by the 9th-ranked adventurer Polaris. Essen almost couldn't believe that he had the opportunity to have his own equipment made by someone like that. Suddenly, Ryuka exclaims. She bows low to Essen in apology, saying sorry for ending up putting him off. Essen reassures her, reminding her that she was the one doing things out of the kindness of her heart. Grabbing the measuring tape on the table, Ryuka declares that she would take care of Essen's stuff quickly as well. Polaris stays at the side as she gives room for Ryuka to measure Essen in peace. Eventually, Ryuka writes the last of her needed details in her notebook, but she suddenly brings something up. Ryuka asks if the two knew each other. Essen and Polaris both confirm that they did, Polaris adding that they were from the same hometown. Ryuka asks if they were both solo adventurers before saying that she found their case rather rare. She knew that most of the time, people from the same place would usually form a party and work together. However, Polaris and Essen didn't seem that close. Essen awkwardly says that they started off in the same party, but the difference in their abilities quickly became apparent. Polaris takes a sip of her tea. With an icy glare, she says that Essen decided to dissolve that party on his own. Looks like someone didn't take that decision too nicely. Essen waves his arms around in a panic, apologizing to her. He tells her that he was aware that he was holding her back. Ryuka laughs, saying that Polaris's growth rate truly was extraordinary. She suddenly appeared and quickly became an advanced adventurer. Then in just a year, she had reached 9th in the rankings. There were plenty of people who couldn't even break through the 10,000th rank in their whole lifetime. But Essen had chosen not to be carried. Shugging his vest on, Essen says that it was a matter of pride. With a determined smile, he asks what was the point of a number that didn't reflect his true ability. Polaris smiles softly at his words. Ryuka comments that she really liked that about him, making Polaris freeze. She seemingly starts to emit a cold air around her again as she thinks about Essen and Ryuka. Essen tells her in a panic that it wasn't like that. Ryuka cuts in, saying that that was the reason she had to make equipment that could help his determination. Polaris asks if a craftsman of Ryuka's caliber was really planning on helping Essen, but Ryuka was sure of it, saying that it was thanks for helping her back in the dungeon. Polaris closes her eyes as an old memory comes to mind of her younger years. She remembers that she had met Ryuka in similar circumstances, being carried away by a monster in her excitement. Suddenly angered, Polaris tells Ryuka that she was starting to cause trouble even for Essen. But Ryuka presses her hands together in apology once more. Ryuka gives her a thumbs up as she swears to Polaris that Essen would truly get stronger. Essen smiles at her words and so does Polaris, saying that she was looking forward to it. Essen meets her determination, saying that he would surely catch up. Ryuka watches their interaction with a pleased smile. Polaris declares that she was heading out, Essen following close behind. They both wave goodbye to Ryuka. Polaris swings the door open as they move to leave. Just as the door opens, Wellness immediately greets her. Of course this guy is suddenly here. In mock concern, he tells her to knock it out when coming to such remote places. Polaris is pissed that he followed her again, but then she catches sight of Essen behind her, looking confused. She grits her teeth as she turns back to Wellness, who was wearing a smug smirk. She wonders if his timing this time was not coincidence. Wellness smiles at them unpleasantly. Polaris is immediately on edge and Ryuka and Essen are confused by Wellness's sudden arrival. Suddenly, Wellness exclaims. He rubs at his nose and comments that there was an unpleasant smell. Polaris's frown deepens. He steps closer to Essen. Wellness makes a show of covering his nose before looking up and down. Clearly uncomfortable, Essen asks him what his problem was. I say it's his oversized ego from the looks of it, but instead his goal is making sure it's everyone's problem too. Still covering his nose, Wellness asks why such a shabby man was at the workshop. Essen immediately frowns and grits his teeth at Wellness's words. Polaris tells him to stop, which will obviously do nothing because the guy deadass stalked her, so what are words gonna do alone? Wellness turns to her and says that that wouldn't do, and that being in the same space as Essen would tarnish her beauty. He turns to Ryuka and says that the same holds true for her. I was joking, but bro really is making his problems be everyone's problems. He tells her to be more selective with her customers, implying that it would lower her status. Rather plainly, Ryuka says that she was being selective already and that it was her business who she welcomed into her home. Flicking her hand in a carefree manner, she says that she didn't recall inviting him. Oh damn, roast his ass. Wellness clicks his tongue, however he picks himself up easily. With a smile and holding his cape over Polaris's shoulder, he says that it didn't matter since he'll be leaving soon, and he only came to pick up Polaris. Essen immediately tells him to stop. He angrily says that Wellness has been incredibly rude since the moment he arrived and demands to know who he was. An asshole. That's who he is. Wellness arrogantly says that Essen didn't even know how to speak properly. He says that that wasn't how a filthy lower rank like Essen should address him, an upper rank adventurer. Essen grits his teeth but doesn't say anything. Wellness says that he supposed it couldn't be helped that a rat from a different world wouldn't know. He properly introduces himself as Wellness rank 73 and a noble genius blessed with talent from the travel god. Unfortunately, they didn't bless him with humility, which cancels everything out in my opinion. With a triumphant yell, Wellness also introduces himself as Polaris's lover. Polaris is struck dumbfounded for a moment before she exclaims in shock. Essen looks horrified and Ryuka simply raises an eyebrow. Truly the only brain cell that is working properly in this room is Ryuka. Essen immediately asks Polaris what was going on and if it was true. Polaris turns to Wellness in a rush, about to ask what he was trying to do, but Wellness cuts her off. In a whisper, he implies that something would happen to Essen if she didn't play along. For someone named Wellness, nothing about him is good. That's just straight up nasty behavior. Polaris frowns in panic. There's a pause between them as Wellness hums pleasantly, waiting for Polaris's response. Through gritted teeth, she agrees that they were lovers. Even nastier to be involved in any way with him, to be honest. Essen looks absolutely broken at the news. Very softly, he says that that made sense since they were both adults and things like that happened. Wellness covers his gleeful expression, trying to force his joy down and hide it from the others. When he looks up, there's a more calm smile on his face. He says that that was how it was. Covering Polaris with his cape as he leads her outside, Wellness turns to Essen and says that now that he understood, he tells Essen not to show his dirty face to them again. Essen doesn't see the barely concealed anger in Polaris's face, too stunned to speak. With one final glance at Essen, Wellness leads Polaris out the workshop. As they walk farther away, Wellness is no longer able to hold back his laughter and cackles joyously. Polaris coldly asks if what just happened satisfied Wellness, calling it childish and tasteless. Wellness says, of course, saying that the pathetic expression Essen wore was quite the sight. His words make Polaris glare at him harshly. Finally, she says that Essen won't break that easily. Wellness smiles in disbelief, saying that Essen already looked pretty upset to him. Seething, Polaris says that that was rather arrogant to say since he was the one who created the situation. Polaris tells him that she felt pathetic for being forced to tell such a stupid lie. Normally, she could eliminate someone like him any time. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. She's literally rank 9. However, Polaris says that doing that would mean attacking a fellow adventurer and she'd be punished. She couldn't afford to have her gift taken away because of someone as insignificant as him. More than anything, she tells him he shouldn't underestimate Essen. With full belief in him, Polaris says that Essen would surely rise up the rankings on his own power because he promised her. He would definitely overcome whatever pain Wellness caused. Wellness stares at her for a second before turning around with a carefree smile, sarcastically complimenting Polaris on her trust on Essen. He says that he'll be watching to see if he recovers. However, even if he did recover, Wellness says that he would just crush him again. Meanwhile, somewhere back in town, Essen silently enters his room. At the sight of the bed, he immediately slumps on top of it like dead weight. His expression horrified and broken, he asks himself why he was taking so much damage from what just happened. Polaris had a lover. That was all there was to it, and yet he couldn't let it go. Polaris was the strongest adventurer. She had her own personal craftsman, and a lover who can fight beside her. If he only knew that Wellness was neither her lover, nor someone on even equal footing. Essen asks himself what reason would she have to wait for him? She already had companions without him. He wonders if it was because of a promise, obligation, or maybe even pity. Opening his mouth in slow realization, Essen softly says that she used to need him around. His eyes slowly close. Back then in a small house, crying could be heard during the night. A little girl sits underneath a window. She suddenly stops when she hears someone whispering, calling out her name. A younger Polaris looks out the window behind her to find a younger Essen. Polaris is surprised to find him there. In a rush, Essen urges her for the both of them to run away. Essen tells Polaris that she couldn't keep living with her violent father. Polaris nervously asks where they would even go, and Essen says that they could go anywhere as long as it wasn't there. Essen breaks the window's glass, and as he's helping Polaris climb down, a man rounds the corner of the house and yells at them. Seeing as Essen had broken the window, the man hits him over the head with a beer bottle, making Polaris scream, "Ah yes," the solution to teaching kids a lesson, giving them head trauma, and emotional trauma from the looks of it. Bleeding and hurt from his head wound, Essen turns to face the man. He determinedly kicks the man between his legs, and the man falls to the ground. "Get him, Essen, get him!" Hand in hand, Essen and Polaris run away from the village. Essen promises that no matter where they went, he would protect her. As he carried her on his back deep in the forest, he asked her if she remembered the dream they talked about. When they turn 10, they'll become adventurers. So now he wanted the two of them to become the best adventurers together. As time went on, their gifts had manifested. With a happy smile, Polaris tells Essen that Silverworld seemed like a powerful gift that helped her control ice. They went on missions together, and Essen would get hurt while Polaris took down the monsters. Looking at the adventure ranking board, Polaris smiles in joy as she shows Essen that she's risen the rankings again. But the expression on Essen's face is complicated as he looks at his own ranking. It still wasn't enough for Polaris, and she continued to aim for rank 1. She climbed and climbed the rankings. At one point, Polaris excitedly turns to look at Essen behind her, but Essen was already lost in the crowd of other adventurers, walking away from her and completely dejected. Damn, it must have been tough watching her go all the way up and to see yourself remain in rock bottom. With a start, Essen wakes up. He finds himself lying flat on the ground. He stares at the sunlight from outside before getting up off the floor. There are bags under his eyes, but he weakly laughs to himself. He tells himself that it was no good, calling himself pitiful for having such a lame dream. As he heads to the well outside the inn to wash up, he finds his situation really embarrassing. He splashes water over his face quietly. After a while, Essen thinks to himself that, truthfully, the only reason Polaris cared about him was probably just because she wasn't the type to disregard a promise. Brother, you deadass got her out of an abusive household. I think she cares about you more than you think. Staring at his distorted reflection in the bucket water, Essen tries to smile and says that more importantly, he needed to apologize to Ryuka. He didn't remember clearly, but he thinks he rudely left without saying anything. Oh, he was completely out of it after that whole mess. He starts to make his way back to the workshop. Ryuka sits outside by a fire, quietly waiting. Not before long, she sees Essen's figure walking in the distance. She immediately lights up at his arrival. Essen presses his hands together and bows his hands in apology. He says sorry for leaving without saying anything. Ryuka laughs and tells him not to worry about it. She tells him that she was concerned for him because he suddenly spaced out and left without saying anything, even when she called out to him. Essen apologizes one more time. Clapping her hands together in excitement, Ryuka says that she was glad he came. The equipment she mentioned yesterday was already finished so he could try it on. Essen is completely dumbfounded to hear that it was already done when it's only been a day. Yeah, that's some crazy product delivery time, practically less than 24 hours, I think. Ryuka laughs, saying that once she started making it, she just got so into it. Essen's smile is frozen in disbelief at her abnormal work speed, thinking that she truly was amazing. Ryuka tells him that his gear was laid out on the table. Essen immediately puts everything on, testing its fitting. Once he was done, he exited the workshop and asked Ryuka to make sure everything was fine. Oh, now he's looking like a proper adventurer. Nicely done for someone who worked on everything on a 24-hour self-inflicted time limit. Ryuka explains each part of the outfit to him. Since Monster Eater was primarily bite-based, she made a headband to protect his head from injuries since it was often targeted. Overall, she focused on mobility using lightweight special fibers from monster materials and armor infused with magic power at key points for solid defense. It also had shape memory function for automatic repair of damaged areas. Despite using C-rank materials, it was designed to withstand even B-rank dungeons, dare I say it. But he looks and is more equipped for fighting than wellness is. Hopping in place excitedly, Essen marvels that the gear was amazing because of how super light it was. Ryuka urges him to try clothing regeneration, and Essen summons his wings. Ryuka brightens immediately, saying that she still loved those beautiful wings, and Essen just smiles awkwardly. She tells him to put his wings away, and immediately after they're gone, the material of his clothes piece back together and cover his back again. Essen says that it was all incredible. Since she used C-rank materials and everything, he says that it must be really expensive, but Ryuka just says that he should consider it an investment in his future. With a bright grin, Ryuka says that she would charge him next time so he should get stronger and earn more money. Essen stares at her for a moment before he laughs and agrees. Oof, that definitely hit a new sore spot. Ryuka stares at him curiously for a moment before she sits back down. She says that as she guessed, he was still feeling down. Completely straightforward, Ryuka asks Essen if he was in love with Polaris. Essen is struck silent at the sudden turn of the conversation. Oh, he's about to receive the talk of a lifetime, I see. Chapter 13. Completely calmly, Ryuka presses Essen, asking him if he was truly in love with Polaris. Essen seems to blank at her words for a moment, but then he frowns deeply. He softly mumbles, wondering if that was truly what he was feeling all this time. Essen asks Ryuka for her thoughts, and she admits that that was what it felt like for her. She says that anyone would think so, especially seeing how obviously depressed he had gotten. Hearing her words, Essen lets out an awkward laugh. He finally crouches down to the ground, his head lowered sadly, pathetically really. Ryuka stares at him blankly for a moment, quite surprised by his reaction. She stays silent for a while before offering that he could talk to her about it. She waits a little more for Essen to process his thoughts. Finally, when Essen keeps his head buried in his arms, Ryuka continues. She says in her line of work she sees something a lot: people who quit being adventurers. Really strong people who couldn't recover after losing a companion. People blessed with gifts who end up getting betrayed by their teammates. And even people who despair at their own limitations the longer they continue. For Ryuka, she thought everyone was strong in their own right, both physically and mentally. After all, people were always risking their lives fighting monsters, so they must have strong willpower to overcome fear. Ryuka raises a walnut up to her eyes as she talks. She lays it on the ground, tapping it a couple of times with a pickaxe before bringing the tool down and destroying its shell, revealing the nut within it. She holds up the walnut to Essen. She tells him that no matter how strong or hard something was, it still had a weak point. Taking a bite of the walnut, she tells Essen that what was inside was even more fragile. Essen momentarily raises his head and looks at the empty walnut shell before burying his face again. He asks if she thought of him as the insides of a cracked walnut. Yep, right now he is a very sad walnut. Ryuka continues and says that there was no use for him to shoulder everything alone, and that it wasn't bad for him to rely on others around him. Essen mumbles out that he understood. He clenches his fist before finally uncurling himself and sitting cross-legged on the ground. He admits that he wasn't quite sure for himself if he was in love with Polaris in the first place. If anything, his desire to protect her was stronger, making Ryuka confused. Essen was aware that it was pretty hard to imagine, but he explains that before Polaris had received her gift, she was actually a frail girl. She had lost her mother early on, and because of that, her father turned to alcohol and became violent. Polaris was forced to just silently endure his violence. Essen gets up and walks over to where Ryuka was sitting. He slumps on the log next to her. He tells Ryuka that he couldn't stand the way Polaris was being treated, so he took her and they ran away from the village. As for what happened after they became adventurers, Ryuka already knew all about it. Essen turns to the sky. He tells Ryuka that a long time ago they had made a promise to one another to become the best adventurers together. He was left behind once, but he kept going because of that promise. However, when Wellness had shown up and said he was Polaris's lover, Essen felt like all the strength had drained from his body, which surprised even him. Essen knew that that event shouldn't have had such an effect on his reason for trying so hard, and yet here he was. He goes quiet for a moment before he slowly turns to Ryuka and asks if it really was jealousy he was feeling, to which Ryuka agrees. Throwing his hands up in the air, Essen sighs heavily and calls himself pathetic. However, Ryuka just laughs and says that it was all fine. Depressed, Essen looks away and says it was definitely not fine that he was realizing that the promise he made Polaris was just an excuse, and now he was feeling such lame emotions. Ryuka just smiles at him and says that she she didn't think it was true, much to Essen's confusion. She says that if he could recognize his ugly feelings and speak them out loud, then she was sure he was going to be fine. Essen's eyes widen at her words, but he looks away, still unsure. He asks her if he would really still be okay since he might not be able to find a reason to keep trying anymore. I ain't gonna lie. Even if Polaris and wellness were a thing, it's not like they're married. You still have a shot, especially if the other guy in question is wellness. Ryuka reassures him that there was no need to change his reason. She waves her finger around and says that Essen was talking using words that wouldn't come out of the mouth of the person who selfishly kidnapped Polaris without even asking what she wanted. Fair point. But also, her dad was beating her up. There's never a good reason to leave a child in an abusive home. Essen winces at her words, saying that what he did sounded terrible when it was put in that way, and Ryuka reprimands him for being so presumptuous. Finally, she asks him if he really was going to give up just because the girl he liked already had a boyfriend. Essen goes quiet, closing his eyes in thought. When he opens his eyes again, there's a determined look on his face. He clenches his face, resolute, as he declares that he didn't want to give up. Ryuka smiles at his response. Essen says that he helped Polaris in the past because he cared for her. And because he cared for her, he wanted to protect her. He wanted to catch up to her. And he wanted to share time with her as fellow adventurers, brother. If I didn't know any better, that sounded like wedding vows. Ryuka gets up and pumps her fist in the air, cheering him on. But just as she does so, he lowers his head and asks if he wasn't being a bother. Ryuka reprimands him for wavering with every statement. Ryuka then points to herself and says that if he was feeling lonely because Polaris abandoned him, quite early to be making fun of the depressed guy, sis. But alright, she asks if Essen would like to be her boyfriend instead. Essen raises his head and gapes at her in shock. Ryuka continues and says that she could be his reason for fighting. Now that she thought about it, if she became Essen's girlfriend, she could be wrapped up in a lizard's tail, embraced by falcon wings, or choked by a frog's tongue. That last one made things go from 0 to 100. Ryuka keeps on going, liking the idea even more. She says that if she was with Essen, she could do all sorts of things with pseudo-monsters. But not only that, the monsters he could produce would keep increasing. As she goes on about how amazing it would be, Essen's expression gets more and more horrified. Finally, he stands back away from her and begs her to spare him, saying he didn't have such perverted tastes. Ryuka then lets out a short cough and says that she was only joking. Essen knew for a fact that she was totally serious about it, however. Either way, Ryuka asks if he was feeling any better. There's a determined look set on Essen's face as he thanks Ryuka for cheering him up. Ryuka tells him not to mention it, since it was painful to see a friend feeling down. She adds that she was also planning to have him become successful, and spend money as her customer. Pumping his fist in the air, he says that he would try his best again. Ryuka grins at him and cheers him on as Essen heads back to the city. Chapter 14. Not before long, Essen is back in action and throwing himself into fighting. He leaps into the air and takes down monsters by activating multiple parts of his gift. He cuts into the monster's flesh and bone, and for the final kill, he takes a bite of them to add to his growing list of abilities. About 3 weeks had passed since Ryuka made him his equipment. During that time, he had explored as many dungeons as possible to acquire new skills. He'd gained abilities like the Valley Griffin's Sky Dash, which lets him kick off the air to jump in mid-air. At this point, he's a video game character. He also obtained the Wetland Basilisk's Evil Eyes, which could petrify anything he focused on. He had a goal of becoming far stronger than before. Essen returns to the guild and heads for the adventurer ranking board. His eyes scan through the names quickly. Finally, they find his name among the thousands of adventurers. Right now, he was at rank 50, 553. That's quite the jump from his old ranking in the 96,000. He was giddy at the idea that in just a little more, he would reach the intermediate border at 50,000. Suddenly, Essen exclaims as Aruru comes up to him asking how he was doing. Completely ecstatic, Essen says that he was on top form. He had cleared out almost all the dungeons she had recommended to him. Aruru praises him before asking if he was looking for new dungeons. Essen says yes, asking if she had any new recommendations to give. However, Aruru says that while dungeon exploration was good, he could also try a different kind of job for a change. Essen asks what she meant. She says that she wanted to request his help for a guild assignment. Although it wasn't widely known, the guild occasionally offers work outside of dungeon exploration. She adds that the compensation was generous. Essen smiles, but he says that at the moment, raising his ranking was his top priority. Aruru pauses before frowning at him. She says that as she's mentioned before, it was precisely when he's doing well that he needed to be more careful. She believed adventurers often needed time away from dungeons to clear their heads. Aruru reassures him that it wasn't hard labor or anything, and he could just think of it as a little break. Essen thinks about it for a second before inevitably agreeing to the commission. Aruru claps her hands in delight. She bids Essen goodbye for a moment as she needs to prepare herself for a bit. As she leaves, Essen wonders what she needed to prepare for. However, up on the second floor balcony, An adventurer seemed to be watching their exchange with almost desperate focus. Several days earlier, at the Wellness Mansion, Wellness sat on a throne calling over a maid holding up beverages. He takes one and turns back to the man he was talking to, asking if the trash adventurer still really hadn't given up. By trash, he means Essen. Just a quick reminder. The man he was talking to was the adventurer from the guild. The adventurer reports that if anything, he seemed even more motivated than before. Wellness clicks his tongue, tapping his finger over the armrest in thought. He sneers, annoyed at the thought. He thought that the best way to break Polaris's spirit was to destroy what she relied on. However, Wellness mumbles to himself that if psychological attacks wouldn't work, then maybe a direct approach would. The adventurer starts to break out in sweat at his words. Wellness eventually suggests that maybe they should just kill him. The adventurer exclaims, saying that that would be problematic. He reasons that if Wellness committed murder, even someone like Wellness himself couldn't escape the travel god church. But he doesn't get to say any more when something goes flying past him, cutting at his cheek and drawing blood. From in front of him, Wellness hums in confusion as his gift's abilities swirl all around him. Wellness asks why the adventurer assumed he would do the killing himself. He asks whether the man really thought that he would just assign him for surveillance and reporting. The man is completely terrified, but the bleeding wound on his cheek reminds him to keep quiet. Wellness walks over to him pleasantly and says that last time he had gone to see Essen directly just to enjoy the pathetic look on his face, but he implies that dirty work like killing was under the adventurer's domain. He motions over to a group of men in suits watching from a distance. Wellness tells him that the adventurer could refuse the command if he wanted, but of course he would have to leave the party, to which the adventurer refuses. With a dark smirk, Wellness reminds the man to be careful that misfortune didn't befall on the people around him, including his family for instance. The man knew he was trapped. Wellness keeps going, unbothered by the man's reactions. He says that he was a kind person, so he would make it so the man didn't have to get his hands dirty directly. The adventurer is confused, but Wellness shoves his hand in the pocket of his robe. He says that he recently received something interesting, and in his hand was a dark-colored orb. The adventurer's face only darkens even more at the realization of what the orb was. Wellness only laughs and refers to it as a secret weapon. In the present day and back in the city, Eruru appears with a small messenger bag. She waves at Essen, apologizing for making him wait. Essen is rather surprised when Eruru urges them to start on their journey. Essen asks what the job was, and Eruru happily says that he would be her escort. He smiles at the thought, saying that monsters didn't usually appear outside the dungeons. Eruru only replies by saying that monsters weren't the only dangerous things out there. Essen is confused, but Eruru doesn't say anything more. Instead, she lets their surroundings speak for itself. Not before long, Essen and Eruru leave the comfort of the main city and enter streets filled with shady-looking people, all giving them observant glares. Essen finally understood that what Eruru meant was that the lower district had more rough characters, just going down a few back alleys, and it was clear to him why having an escort was better. He asks Eruru why she had to come to a place like that. She tells him that the guild regularly checked on the well-being of inactive adventurers. They confirmed the safety of adventurers staying in this city, focusing on those who haven't used the guild services for a while. Essen comments that it was quite a demanding job, but finally getting the full grasp of the situation, he says that he would protect her with his life. Eruru smiles at him brightly and thanks. As Eruru had said, they spent their time checking in on the inactive adventurers. Essen just looming behind Eruru and making sure they didn't try anything threatening. They went from house to house to look for everyone. As they were walking, Essen praised Eruru, much to her surprise. Essen explains that it was amazing that she never got lost. He asks if she had a map in her head or something similar. Eruru explains that it was thanks to her gift called Guide. It helped her choose the correct path. Other than that, she could find lost items or locate the owners of lost items. Essen comments how interesting it was compared to the abilities of most adventurers. Eventually, Eruru crosses out the last of the inactive adventurers they had to visit. Essen was glad everything went smoothly, and Eruru says that it was all thanks to her. He tells her that if there was any way he could be of help, she could just call him anytime, an offer that Eruru gladly accepts. As they part ways, Eruru thanks Essen for the day, and he bids her goodbye, wishing her a safe trip back. He waves goodbye and decides to do some shopping before making his way home. Later in the day, Essen walks back to his place. He managed to restock on daily necessities and adventuring supplies, so it wasn't a bad day off for him. Suddenly, as he nears his room, he notices a piece of paper stuck to his door. Essen is annoyed, thinking it was a prank and that they had ruined rental property. However, something was written on the piece of paper. It said that they had kidnapped the receptionist who had been with him. If Essen didn't want her killed, the culprits ordered him to come to the abandoned warehouse in the back alley. Essen freezes in complete shock and disbelief. If what it said was true, Eruru had been kidnapped. Chapter 15. He crumples the blackmail letter in his hand before realizing that the letter was stuck to the door using the hairpin Eruru was wearing during their day out. Essen glares at the sheet of paper before he clicks his tongue. In his rush to leave and go after Eruru and the kidnapper, he drops his supplies right there in the hallway. Eventually, his running leads him to a rundown place that was mentioned in the letter. He stares up at the building, wondering what on earth happened to Eruru. It was in a perfectly deserted location. Essen wonders who was the mastermind behind the kidnapping and why they would kidnap Eruru in the first place. He runs his hand through the wall of the building, wondering what it looked like from the inside. Eventually, he feels a gap through the crudely built stone wall and peeks in. What he sees makes him freeze. It seemed to be a rough-looking mercenary, and beside him was a bound Eruru. The man held a large blade up to Eruru, and without thinking twice, Essen burst into the room. The mercenary gets up, surprised, but also glad that Essen really arrived. Eruru's eyes, mouth, and hands were bound. Although she's unable to see, Eruru recognizes Essen's voice. She tries to say something to him, but her mouth remains gagged, and all she's able to do is make small, muffled sounds. From the doorway, Essen asks if Eruru was okay and reassures her that he was there to rescue her. However, before he can get close, the mercenary holds up his blade to Eruru's neck, ordering Essen to stay put. Eruru trembles as the sharp blade presses against her neck. Essen panics almost as much as her, ordering the mercenary not to hurt Eruru. He couldn't understand the mercenary's intentions as they were complete strangers. With a shaky, nervous smile, the mercenary tells Essen that it was because he wouldn't give up. Essen is confused, but the man says that it was because Wellness wanted to get his hands on Polaris, so he ordered the mercenary to get rid of Essen. Essen is furious to hear that it was all about Wellness's doing. However, he catches on that the mercenary mentioned that Wellness wanted to get his hands on Polaris. He's confused because as far as he knew, Polaris and Wellness were already dating. The belief that Polaris would date a guy like that is a crime in itself. The mercenary admits to Essen that they weren't, which was why he was forced to do what he was doing. The mercenary grits his teeth in anger, saying that Essen and Polaris just kept on resisting, so he had no choice but to kill him now. Essen realizes they captured Eruru for the sole purpose of luring him out. The man keeps on going, saying that Wellness had always been like that. He helped low-ranking adventurers a little to earn favors and increase his followers. And if someone didn't do as he wanted, he used the others to prevent them from forming parties or harassed them with violence. A scumbag through and through. Essen grits his teeth and clenches his fists in barely concealed anger. He finally understood that the whole lovers thing between Wellness and Polaris was a lie, and Polaris was forced to react that way to prevent him from getting hurt unnecessarily. And now, because of him, Eruru has been taken hostage. Finally, Essen calmly says that he understood the situation, however. He asks that the mercenary let go of Eruru since he was the real target. If the man kept threatening him by keeping Eruru hostage, then he was no better than Wellness. The man's eyes widened in shock. Not only that, Essen reasons that even if the man did kill him, he would just get caught by the Travel God Church. He asks if that was what the man really wanted, but the mercenary cuts him off, telling him to shut up. He says that he didn't have any other choice, and Wellness had promised him as long as he could keep Essen there. Essen shouts back at the man, asking what he was planning on doing after keeping him there. He points out that the man was at a dead end, so he should just give up and let go of Eruru, but the man smirks at his words, not agreeing with Essen that he was at his dead end. He pulls out the orb he got from Wellness, the so-called secret weapon. It was a magic sealing jewel with a sealed monster inside. The mercenary was convinced that if he used that, then he wouldn't be guilty of any crime. Essen would die after being attacked by a suddenly appearing monster. He tosses the orb into the air and it immediately begins glowing with a harsh light. The orb breaks and before all of them, flames erupt and a powerful roar echoes throughout the room as a monster is summoned. The monster lets out another powerful roar as it fully escapes its prison. The man laughs in amazement, but Essen is petrified in shock. Eruru is unaware of what was going on, still bound and gagged. The mercenary, thinking himself victorious, tells Essen that the monster was a volcano dragon, a monster that was especially dangerous even among A-rank beasts. However, he's suddenly cut off. Time almost seems to stop for the mercenary and for Essen as the dragon swipes at the man with its claws, effectively cutting him in half. Essen flinches as the man's up body crashes into the wall behind him. He's unable to look. The dragon lets out puffs of smoke from its mouth, head lowered away from Essen. Meanwhile, Essen was still in shock at the summoned monster in front of him. He forces himself to snap out of his thoughts since it wasn't the time to worry about that. He quickly activates his gift and stretches out his tongue to reach Eruru. Essen pulls her away in time just as the dragon attacks the spot where she once was. Essen quickly helps her out of her bindings, asking if she was injured. Eruru reassures him that she's fine. Essen looks up to check on the dragon and finds it standing over the mercenary's corpse, most likely about to eat it. He asks Eruru if she could stand and quickly tells her to make her escape. In a panic, Eruru urges Essen that they should escape together. She argues that if the monster really was a volcano dragon, then it had the power to instantly kill even intermediate adventurers. They needed to call advanced adventurers. For the meantime, the dragon was preoccupied eating the corpse in front of it. Eruru continues to convince Essen, but he quickly shuts her down. With a determined look in his eyes, he tells her that he was going to hold it off. Eruru's eyes flood with tears and concern for him. Essen tells her to go get reinforcements because they couldn't let something like that run loose. Eruru goes quiet, trying to figure out a way to convince him. If Essen was honest, he wanted to run away too, but if he fled now, the damage would be even greater. His legs were shaking in fear, but he let out a reassuring smile. Taking out his fangs, Essen turns to the volcano dragon. He tells Eruru that every time he chose not to run, it made him stronger, so he was going to stay and fight. Eruru stares at his back, still unsure. To make her feel better, Essen tells her that if things got really dangerous, he would escape. He gives her a wink and promises not to do anything reckless. Eruru stares at him, still torn, but finally she purses her lips together. She wipes away her tears and says that she understood. She quickly runs, yelling after him that she would bring advanced adventurers right away. She makes him promise not to die until then. Essen makes sure she's gone before he turns back to the dragon. He tells it to settle down a bit. The dragon had finished eating the corpse, leaving only a bloody puddle, and was now glaring down at Essen. Essen couldn't help but feel intimidated by its incredible pressure. He wonders if Polaris was always fighting monsters like it. Essen takes out his crab claws and dashes towards the dragon. The dragon immediately moves to meet him halfway. Essen jumps away in time as it goes for a bit, its head plummeting to the ground from the force. However, the shock of the attack had hit his crab arm and it shattered, much to Essen's horror. The dragon uses its head to knock Essen back. Unprepared for the attack, he goes crashing into the wall. Wounded, Essen struggles to get up from the wreckage. He coughs out blood as he swears. The dragon was way too strong. If only he could somehow get close enough, maybe he would stand a chance if he got the dragon's gift. Using his rabbit legs, he circles the dragon. When he's at a certain distance, he takes out his air cannons and fires at the dragon. The attacks hit its body, but it didn't seem to affect it at all. The dragon glares at him before seemingly clenching its teeth for another attack. Essen freezes as he waits for its next move. He remembered that the volcano dragon inhabited the volcano of destruction. It was a monster that fought using its super hard scales and fire-breathing mouth. With his current abilities, he didn't have an effective attack. The dragon opens its mouth, gaining enough power to fuel the fire burning in its throat. Essen had only one option: to use its power against it. Seeing all the bags of flour around him, he quickly uses his abilities to have it scatter all over the air. He challenges the dragon to shoot its breath at him. Essen wanted it to taste its own power. With one powerful breath of fire, everything around them explodes. Chapter 16. A man and a woman walk down the alleys of the slums. They talk animatedly, lost in their conversation. However, it's quickly disrupted by a large boom. The earth shook, and they're knocked off their feet. They exclaim in panic, thinking it was an earthquake. From afar, they see a large amount of smoke quickly climbing up the sky. They figure that it was an explosion, but the girl couldn't understand why it was in that area specifically. She wonders if someone was using their gift or something and it caused the explosion. As they're looking up, something large was hurtling itself towards them at an incredible speed. They're only able to dodge it within seconds as it lands directly where they were standing just before. The thing that fell from the sky turned out to be Essen, his gift activated to protect him from the fall. However, he curses and grunts in pain. His wings had taken damage from the insane power of the explosion alone. The guy and girl from earlier panic at the sight of him, thinking he was the monster that caused the explosion. Essen immediately tries to defend himself but brushes the thought away as quickly. He shifts to warning the surrounding people of the danger of the dragon in the warehouse and tells them to evacuate as soon as possible. He turns around in alarm as they're suddenly overtaken by a very bright light. He summons a large claw as a shield, but it's only enough to protect him. In the next second, a powerful breath of fire is shot right at them from across the slums. Dust and smoke kick up everywhere. When most of it passes, the land is completely charred and barren. Essen's clothes are singed all over, but the hand that summoned the claw shield was rather burnt as it took the brunt of the damage. Getting up from the ground, Essen looks around him to realize that he was alone. He turns around, his face horrified as he wonders how many people were taken out by a single fire breath. From the smoke still curling up around him, he could see a massive figure getting closer. It was the dragon, looming over the barren wasteland, its teeth bared to attack. It spreads its wings and Essen flinches as its feet slowly lift from the ground and into the sky. He realizes that if he let the dragon come any closer to that part of the slums, even more people would die. Through shaking legs, he forces himself to his feet. He charges right at the dragon with a summoned claw. He quickly slashes at the dragon's wings to keep it from flying away, but upon contact, his claw shatters and the wings remain unscratched. Essen couldn't believe that his attacks couldn't even damage the wing membrane. Enraged, the dragon opens its mouth for another breath. It spits out balls of fire at Essen, and at his current distance, he takes the damage full force. He screams in pain as he's pelted by flame after flame. He's eventually forced to the ground, writhing from his burns. He struggles to get up, reaching out a hand desperately towards the dragon as it prepares to take off again. He wonders to himself if this was as far as he could go. However, just then, a voice calls out to him, or more specifically, it calls out to Essen, calling pathetic while emphasizing each syllable. The dragon is pushed back by a large shot of flames. Essen and the dragon are both caught off guard. Essen forces himself to sit up as he watches the newcomer push back even the volcano dragon's pressure. The voice was more than familiar to him. The newcomer leaps into the air and throws another powerful burst of flames at the dragon. A figure enveloped by smoke and flames lands in between Essen and the dragon. It was Keith. Keith laughs merrily, greeting Essen since it's been a while since the last time they met and commenting that he looked rough. In complete disbelief, Essen asks what he was doing there. Keith explains that he stopped by the guild because he had some business when a guild receptionist burst into the hall looking frantic. The guild receptionist, Eruru, had told the others that a volcano dragon had appeared in an abandoned warehouse in the back alley, and they needed the guild to issue an emergency alert immediately. Keith also heard Eruru say that a lower-ranked adventurer was trying to hold off the dragon, and they needed high-ranked adventurers to back them up as soon as possible. Keith heard Eruru say Essen's name. With that, he had come there as the strongest adventurer to lend Essen his aid. Not only that, he still owed Essen from last time. Essen smiles, rather touched, until he says offhandedly that Keith's rank wasn't much higher than Essen's, so it was still pretty dangerous. Keith tells him not to talk nonsense. Since they last met, he had been training and growing. As a result, he finally broke through B rank not too long ago. As such, Keith says that Essen couldn't lump him in with him, someone who just cared about collecting more and more skills. Essen exclaims in shock to hear that Keith was already at B rank. He takes Keith by the shoulders and praises him being amazing, saying that he really was the strongest adventurer. Keith laughs, pleased with his words. However, Keith also adds that Essen was the strongest adventurer that he ever acknowledged. With full determination, Keith tells Essen that they should wrap up the ridiculous volcano dragon incident quickly, so he could catch up to him in the ranks. Essen smiles just as resolved, and Keith is satisfied with his answer. Their conversation is interrupted by a large nearing footstep. They turn as the dragon nears them. Essen is pumped up that they would be having their first team-up in a while. Suddenly, the dragon breathed fire into the ground. Essen and Keith jump up to dodge the attack, but Essen exclaims in shock that the attack had instead burned the ground. The dragon had turned the whole place into a field that worked in its favor. Essen was worried. He had a skill that let him stay airborne, but Keith didn't have that last time he checked. However, to his surprise, Keith just hollers in glee that monsters could get pretty crafty once they hit A rank. Essen tries to warn him about the burning earth. However, the moment Keith hit the ground, he immediately dashed towards the dragon without a problem, his feet coated with water. With absolute resolve, Keith yells at the dragon that it wasn't the only one good with fire since he was Keith of the Scorching Sun, the strongest adventurer who commanded flames. He summons more fire and throws it straight at the dragon. Keith's flames hit the dragon's wing, however, the dragon merely flapped its wing to blow out the fire. Keith laughs, saying that his last attack was still a work in progress. From the sidelines, Essen marvels at Keith's current strength. He remembers that Keith had made sure his body could withstand his gift by getting himself a blessing that gave him even stronger fire resistance. Essen summons out his tail and swings at the dragon. However, the dragon parries his attack with its own tail, shattering most of Essen's barbed end. Even Keith's explosive flames that were currently at B rank barely made the dragon flinch unless it was a sneak attack. Essen knew that there was no way for them to win if they attacked separately. Keith shields himself from a burst of flames from the dragon. Suddenly, Essen leaps out from behind him, saying that they should use the combo move they used that time they worked together. However, at his own words, Essen seems to stop. He thinks about the idea of a combo move and stacking attacks together. From below him, Keith points out that although it helped up their firepower, the attack barely worked on the leaf shrimp, so it might not do anything to the dragon. Essen is hardly listening to him. He suddenly thinks about how he never considered the idea because he always kept switching without thinking. His gift turned his body into that of a monster, however, that didn't mean he was limited to a set number of skills at once. He hadn't thought about the idea of using 2 skills at the same time. Keith called out to Essen as he went quiet, but he noticed Essen was still heading straight for the dragon. Essen figured that if he could evolve his current abilities into a brand new skill, one that combined sharpness, weight, and toughness all into one, then maybe he could get stronger too. He summons a new skill. With the base of a large claw, he creates the Monster Eater Greatsword and plunges it at the dragon.